On the 11th of August, 2024, a Pakistani man named Murad Sadpara was coming down from Broad Peak with somebody else's gear on his back. 10 days earlier, he had brought a body down from 8,200 meters on K2 Fassi, a body nobody had been able to reach for a whole year. Now he was walking down the safest stretch of the route, at an altitude where there's almost no mountain left. One short leg separated him from the tents of base camp. They still didn't get to him in time, and the mountain that took him is still being sold as the most accessible 8,000er in the Karakoram. Of the 10 stories you're about to hear, 5 don't even have a body. In the catalogs of expedition companies, Broad Peak comes with a label that's meant to reassure you: an easy 8,000er, a training peak, a warm-up before its big neighbor. 8,051 meters, the Karakoram, the far north of Pakistan, right on the border with China. 12th highest of the planet's 14 8,000ers. Almost at the end of the queue, the place people usually come to for the first 8,000er on their personal list. The height, by the way, is still a muddle. Some sources stick with 8,047 meters. International reference books more often give 8,051. 4 meters of difference means nothing to anyone except the people who compile tables. But it shows nicely how poorly this mountain is known in detail. The name translates literally broad mountain. This isn't an elegant peak. It's a stretched-out massif with several summits on one ridge. Remember that detail. It will explain half the stories in this episode. It stands on the Godwin-Austen Glacier, and its base camp is shared with K2, the same tents, the same ice underneath them, the same view from the vestibule. The only difference is where you head in the morning. So, people come here in 2 streams. Some aren't ready for K2 yet and want to try 8,000 on something simpler. Others have already come for K2, didn't get the weather, and don't want to lose the whole season. And now, the price of the ticket. For every 100 successful ascents of Broad Peak, there are roughly 8 deaths. 8 per 100 is not the number of a training mountain, and it has been holding that score for almost 70 years, neither slowing down nor speeding up. What's more, it mostly takes not beginners who got lost on the approach, but the ones who did everything right and made it to the top. The history here is counted from the 9th of June, 1957. On that day, 4 Austrians reached the summit: Hermann Buhl, Kurt Diemberger, Markus Schmuck, and Fritz Wintersteller. Schmuck leads the expedition. They go in 2 pairs up the West Ridge. The way they do it looks almost provocative for 1957. No oxygen, no high-altitude porters. None of the siege pyramid that was then considered the only workable tactic on a big mountain. 50 people hauling tons of loads upwards for months, so that 2 of them can stand briefly on the summit one day. The Austrians arrive as a party of 4 and look after themselves, carrying, fixing, cooking, climbing. Later, this will be called Alpine style. In 57, on an 8,000er, it looks like a way of not coming back. All 4 of them get to the top. Before them, no expedition had ever brought its full team onto an 8,000er. Usually 1 person saw the summit, 2 at most, while the rest worked for them lower down. And a few weeks later, in the same season, on neighboring Chogalisa, Buhl steps onto a snow cornice, and the cornice goes down with him. Diemberger is right behind him and survives. He's the one who will later tell how it happened. The body was never found. To be precise, he died not here, but across the road from Broad Peak, the same summer, on the same expedition. The mountain began its history with a man who climbed it and didn't live to the end of the season. And one more note before the count begins. The worst thing that ever happened here took place on the 30th of July this year. An avalanche took 10 people at once. We have a separate video about it. The link is below. Today, about the previous 70 years. Let's sort out how the massif is built, once for the whole episode. We won't come back to this. It explains almost everything you're about to hear. Broad Peak takes people not on the way up, but on the way down. And its geometry is to blame. It has 2 summits, one after the other. First, the ridge brings you out onto a rocky 4 summit. It's called Rocky Summit, 8,028 meters. The whole Karakoram opens up around you, and for someone who has been climbing from below for 18 hours, it looks like the finish line. Except, the finish is further on. The real summit is 8,051, and between them lie about 400 meters of corniced ridge, a narrow snow edge with a drop on both sides, China on the left, Pakistan on the right. Crossing it takes anywhere from half an hour to an hour. People usually say 40 minutes. Those 40 minutes are the mechanism of this mountain. You're already at 8,000, there's a third of the air you're used to. You set out in the dark, and the day is visibly tilting towards evening. And now, you're being offered another hour and a half there, and back along an edge where two people can't pass each other. Plenty of people didn't take the offer. For years, they went home from somebody else's summit, wrote it into their list, and never suspected a thing. In '94, the South Tyrolean Hans Kammerlander planted a ski pole on the real summit with a piece of rope tied to it, and then asked people coming down whether they'd seen it up there. The answer showed straight away who had actually been where. Today there's a bamboo pole standing there instead. And one more thing you'll notice yourself. People here don't so much die as disappear. In 5 of the 10 stories there is no body, no grave, no point on the map. 10 stories lie ahead. The first one happened where, by all calculations, there's almost no mountain left. Below Skardu, the main town of Pakistan's Gilgit-Baltistan, lies the Sadpara Valley. An ordinary mountain settlement, a lake, fields, stone houses, snow up to the roofs in winter. A good share of the country's strongest high-altitude workers come from here. Murad came from here too. Let's deal with the name right away, otherwise the whole episode will congeal into one family. Sadpara has a simple explanation. It isn't a family name, but a tag taken from the name of the village, something like, from Sadpara. Murad Sadpara, Ali Sadpara, who died on K2 in 21, and Sharif Sadpara, who gets his own story a little later, share a name because they share a birthplace. Not a single source confirms any blood relation between them. There are hundreds of such Sadparas in one valley. Murad is 35. Some Western reports put him at 33. That's an error. The Pakistani press and the Alpine Club of Pakistan are unanimous here. At home, a wife, 3 daughters, and a son. The mountains for him are not a way of life or a search for himself. It's seasonal work, one of the few jobs in these parts that actually pays decently. In summer, he carries loads for foreigners. In winter, he gets on a tractor because in winter there are no clients in the Karakoram, and a family has to be fed all year round. The money here says more than words. A Pakistani high-altitude porter earns between 500,000 and 700,000 rupees for a month-long expedition. The sum looks solid right up until you find out what it goes on. Oxygen for himself costs so much that a man regularly chooses, buy a bottle, or take that money home. Most choose the second and then breathe at 8,000 meters with their own lungs for somebody else's ascent. By the summer of 2024, Murad had 4 big summits behind him, including K2. In the community, he wasn't known for that list. The summit lists of Pakistani high-altitude workers rarely impress foreigners anyway. They go where they're hired to go, not where they'd like to. Something else impressed people. A year earlier, Murad had climbed Nanga Parbat twice, 8,126 meters, one of the hardest mountains in the country, and fitted it into 6 days without oxygen, twice in 6 days. An ordinary commercial expedition to Nanga Parbat takes more than a month. Nearly every obituary would later repeat that figure of his, but that isn't what made him truly known. Murad was known as a rescuer, one of the people you call when somebody has been left up there. In 2023, he worked on the team that brought the body of the Afghan climber Akbar Ali Saki down from Camp 3 on K2. Before that, nobody had ever been brought down from K2. The mountain is too steep, too high, and too dangerous to move a motionless load the size of a human being down it. The team was put together by Abid Sadpara. Before setting out, they trained on the 6,000er Kosar gang. They managed it. That was the first body ever taken off that mountain. In the summer of 2024, he joined an expedition with a name that sounded like an advertising slogan, Climb to Change. For 50 days, the team collected rubbish at 16 points across the Karakoram, including the base camps of K2 and Broad Peak, and carried out around 1 ton, 700 kilograms of it. Working alongside him were the climber Naila Kiani, the Portuguese Maria Conceição, and Dilawar Sadpara. Those 3 names are worth keeping in mind. They will turn up next to Murad again in his last days. Kiani would say of him later, briefly and matter-of-factly, he was one of the best, and there were big plans for him, to send him abroad to study and get international certification outside Pakistan. Those plans had less than a month left, and before them came July and K2. A year earlier, in the summer of 2023, the Pakistani porter Mohammed Hassan Shigri died on K2. His story is covered in full in a separate episode of ours. The link will be below the video, and there's no point retelling it here. For today's story, only one thing matters. The body stayed up there, in the worst place on the mountain, the bottleneck, a narrow ice couloir at about 8,200 meters, directly beneath the overhanging Sirax. You can't linger there. Helicopters don't fly there. Nobody is carried out of there. Hassan lay there for a year. On the 29th of July, 2024, a team assembled specifically for him went up. Dilawar Sadpara, Akbar Hussain, Zakir Hussain, Ali Mohammed, and Murad Sadpara. Naila Kiani directed the operation. The logistics were run by Imran Ali and Wali Ullah Fallahi. The body was frozen into the ice. Freeing it from the ice took about 7 hours. 7 hours of work at 8,200 meters under the Sirax, with a constant counter running in your head. How much longer your own body will hold out, and how much weather is left. Then came the descent. It took 3 days and ended on the 1st of August. A motionless load the size of a human being. Vertical fixed ropes, ice slopes, camp after camp. This operation is called the highest altitude body recovery in the history of K2. It was done by 5 men from one Pakistani valley for one of their own. Murad came down to base camp, and a few days later left to pick up the rest of the season on the neighboring mountain. It's a very short walk from the shared tents to Broad Peak. The job was an ordinary one. Murad hired on as a high-altitude worker for the Portuguese climber Maria Conceição, the same woman who had been carrying rubbish out of the base camps with him a month earlier. That season she became the first Portuguese woman on the summit of K2, and Broad Peak looked like a pleasant addition to the main success of the summer. A Nepali Sherpa was going up with them. The summit didn't happen. The team turned around short of the top, and here the sources diverge. The Pakistani papers write about bad weather. The international agencies say the client became unwell. Both versions exist side by side, and there's no choosing between them. Nobody who was up there has ever publicly separated the two. The reason doesn't matter. The expedition was over at that point. What remained was the part of the work that never gets written up in reports. Everything hauled up has to be brought back down. Tents, ropes, bottles, cookware, food. Murad was asked to collect the gear from Camp 3. This is the least visible part of high-altitude work and one of the most exhausting. After a canceled ascent, the client usually goes down first and is already thinking about the journey home. The porter climbs up one more time, takes the camp apart, packs his rucksack with somebody else's things, and carries them down the same route he has just walked up. Over one expedition, the same stretch gets covered many times, and each pass is worse than the last. The snow softens, the slope changes, strength runs out, and by the end of the season, everyone's attention drops. He goes down on the morning of the 11th of August, 2024. The ascent is canceled, the work is done, the dangerous part of the route is left above. At least, that's how it looks from the outside. 5,200 meters, just above base camp. For an 8,000er, this isn't even altitude, it's the hallway. You still meet people here without crampons. You can sit down on a rock and catch your breath. From here, it's one leg down to the tents. This is where you take your gloves off, where you start thinking about a shower, the road home, and the money you'll bring your family. For him, at that moment, the mountain was already over. A rock comes down from above. On slopes like this, it happens all the time. The sun lets the ice go, and rock that the frost held all night slides and heads down. That's why experienced people cross the scree sections early in the morning. That's exactly how Murad was moving. His helmet was on. He was clipped into the fixed line. He did nothing wrong, and that's the hardest part of his story. The actions were flawless, and the outcome? One single hit from a rock. A helmet doesn't save you from a rock that size. According to Naila Kiani, he was believed to have a serious internal injury. He is still alive on the route. And this is where the part begins that Pakistan will spend weeks going over. Kiani raises the alarm through social media. She demands that the army urgently send 4 climbers from Skardu to the bottom of the route, to the place where you put your crampons on. And here, the bitterest part begins. The distance on the mountain itself was short. From base camp to the place where he lay is a brief climb over moraine and glacier. The problem wasn't the trail. The rescuers first had to be brought up to base camp from the valley, from Skardu, and for that, an army helicopter and clearance to fly were needed. While all of that was being arranged, a man was lying up there with physically nobody able to reach him. 6 men set out, 4 from the village of Sadpara and 2 from Shigar. The names are known: Dilawar, Akbar Hussain, Zakir, and Ashraf Sadpara. And now, put the dates together. The 1st of August, the bottleneck, 8,200. Somebody else's body. 3 days of descent. The 11th of August, the same people running up the neighboring mountain. 3 of the 4 now heading for Murad had stood with him in the ice on K2 10 days earlier and spent 7 hours working Hassan free from it. Back then they went for a stranger and succeeded. Now they were going for one of their own. They don't make it in time. By the time the group reaches the spot, everything is already over. Murad dies before they arrive, on the rocks just above base camp. The body is found at 6 in the morning on the 12th of August. Then Army Aviation steps in. The helicopter comes in twice. First, Murad is carried to the Japanese base camp. From there, he's taken to Skardu, and then to his village, the very one whose name he carried instead of a surname. That's where he'll be buried, among people half of whom work in the mountains exactly the way he did. The country responds louder than you'd expect, for a man barely known outside Gilgit-Baltistan. Condolences come from President Asif Ali Zardari and Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif. The chief minister of Gilgit-Baltistan, Gulbar Khan, calls him a brave pioneer. The Alpine Club of Pakistan calls him a true legend of the climbing community. The club's secretary, Karar Hydri, confirms the death officially, and Naila Kiani says a line that will then travel through every publication. Perhaps, if they had reached Murad sooner, today's news would have been different. And then she does what people usually don't do in cases like this. Instead of even-handed thanks to everyone involved, she publicly names the reason for the delay, red tape, as she called it, and demands that the emergency response protocols be rewritten. Her logic is hard. In her words, the man was lying at 5,200 meters, not in the death zone, not on a corniced ridge, not somewhere help is physically impossible, but at an altitude a helicopter can reach and land at. And he still died while the flight was being cleared. Whether anything in those protocols changed after her demand has not been publicly reported. Between those 2 dates, 10 days, the 5 men who had spent 7 hours freeing somebody else's body from the ice and 3 days carrying it down from 8,200 meters could not reach one of their own, at an altitude where the trail is well trodden and you don't even need crampons. Naila Kiani put it like this: a climber who saved many and brought Hassan Shigri's body out of the bottleneck on K2 left far too early himself. They wrote about him for several days running. The big Pakistani papers, the agencies, television. For a high-altitude worker, that's rare. Usually people like him make the news as a single line at the end of a seasonal roundup, listing foreign clients and their achievements. Here, it came out the other way round. The name of a man who was never a client himself, who never once climbed a mountain for his own list, was remembered by the country better than the names of those he took up there. Notice what isn't in this story. There's no cornice breaking away underfoot. There's no fall to the Chinese side. There are none of those 40 minutes between the 2 summits. No pulmonary edema, no direction lost in a storm, no disappearance without a trace. All of that is coming, in the 9 stories still ahead. And here, it's simply a rock that came down from above at exactly the moment when a man with somebody else's load on his back was walking home along a stretch that nobody on this mountain considers dangerous. A wife, 3 daughters, and a son were left waiting for him at home. Behind him, a winter tractor, summer earnings, K2, 2 Nanga Parbats in 6 days without oxygen, and 2 people brought down from a mountain nobody had ever been brought down from before him. 35 years old. Broad Peak, a mountain with a reputation for being easy, took him where the glaciers end and the way down begins. The 9 remaining stories happened higher up, on the route, on the ridge, on the summit itself, and in those 40 minutes between its 2 points. Up there, the mountain works the way it does best. On the 29th of June, 1983, a British doctor dies in a tent at 7,500 meters. A few hours earlier, he had been hauling his partner down the mountain, a man who could no longer walk. Then it was his turn. Now they were hauling him. On Broad Peak, everything had gone well that season. The mountain climbed twice, everybody alive, and one pair came up an hour short of the summit. That hour decided everything. Pete Thexton knew more about high-altitude pulmonary edema than anyone else on his team, and it did not save him. Peter Thexton's friends simply called him Pete. By the summer of '83, he is 30. A doctor with 5 years behind him, and one of those British climbers whose name is known inside a narrow circle and completely unknown outside it. He qualified in 1978. After that came the usual road of a young British medic of that time. Junior posts in hospitals in Nottingham, Mansfield, Sheffield. He never settled anywhere for long. That kind of work suits a man whose real life happens somewhere other than a hospital. The contracts are short, and an expedition fits neatly in between. In '79, he was taken into the Alpine Climbing Group, a closed circle of strong British climbers that you don't apply to join, you get invited into. The sharpest description of him came from his friend Paul Nunn later in an obituary. An inner fire. He climbed for the pleasure of it, not for a list of summits. He never pushed his own mistakes onto other people, a rare quality in a business where almost any failure can be pinned on somebody else's decision. And he stayed calm at exactly the moments when everyone else was tipping into a nervous rush. Nunn also noted two small everyday details that bring a man to life better than any character sketch. A small frame with an enormous appetite, and a habit of sunbathing in sub-zero temperatures. And Thexton carried an experience that, in company like that, people try not to ask about. In '78, on the approach to the summit of La Toc 2, in the Braldu Gorge, his friend Pat Fearnahoe died. Thexton was alone with him. Nunn would later write it plainly. He was badly damaged by being alone with a dying friend, with nobody to call. 5 years later, it would happen again, mirrored. Only now, it would be somebody else beside the dying man, and the one dying would be him. In the winter of 1980 to '81, Thexton works as doctor to a Himalayan expedition. There turned out to be far more actual medicine there than the job description promised. In Nunn's words, he cured half of Khumbu, seeing local people right there on the way, in the villages along the trail. But he also had an interest of his own, almost a research interest. Thexton was taken up with what altitude does to human lungs, not as a theorist and not as a patient, as a working doctor. Every season he saw the illness in living people and knew how it ends if you don't lose height in time. Let's explain it once right now. We'll come back to this mechanism more than once in this video. At 8,000 meters, there is only about a third as much air as at sea level. The body answers the lack of oxygen simply. The vessels in the lungs narrow, the pressure inside them rises, and the lungs gradually fill with fluid. Breathing gets harder with every hour. A man drowns from the inside while standing on a dry slope. At first, it looks ordinary. A cough, weakness, breathlessness that doesn't go away even when you sit down. Then the man stops keeping the pace, then he stops walking at all. Drugs only buy time. The one reliable cure is to lose altitude, and to lose it fast. The cruelest part here is the speed. The edema develops in hours. In the morning, a man walks up perfectly well with everybody else, and by nightfall he can't cover 100 meters. And it's harder to recognize the beginning in yourself than in somebody else. Tiredness, breathlessness, and a heavy head are things everyone has at that altitude, and everyone is used to writing them off as altitude in general. In other people's patients, Thexton picked it up within an hour. In himself, as it turned out later, he didn't. Paul Nunn would put it later in a single line. The irony is that Pete Thexton died of a condition that so intrigued him. The '83 expedition is put together by Doug Scott and Alan Rouse, two names that in British climbing at the time mean just about everything. The plan is ambitious. Broad Peak first, then K2, and all of it in Alpine style, a small team, no siege pyramid. There are 10 people on the list: Scott, Rouse, the Frenchman Jean Afanasieff, the Australian Greg Child, Roger Baxter Jones, Andy Parkin, Stephen Sustad, Thexton, and the Pakistani Gohar Shah, who works both as a porter and as a climber, and Don Willans. Willans is a figure apart here, a legend of British climbing from the 50s and 60s, a man who is an era in himself. He is 50 now, the fitness long gone, and, going by the book Child would write later, He refuses to carry loads or even to cook, explaining it by his seniority. Remember him. In a few days, his presence in a tent will matter more than everything he has done before. Thexton doesn't come alone. He brings Beth Akers with him. She stays at base camp, bakes bread, and meets the men when they come down. The warm-up before the 8,000er is the rock spires of the Lobsang group. From the 10th to the 13th of June, Scott, Child, and Thexton make the first ascent in history of Lobsang Spire, 5,707 meters of sheer granite. It is one of the first uses of big wall technique and portal edges in the Karakoram, men living for days right on the wall, hanging off it like a balcony with no floor. On the summit, a lammergeier circles over them. Scott would later describe Thexton on that wall in one phrase: slow but methodical and calm, as if he were back in the operating theater. At the same time, Thexton couldn't work with aid placements and would ask his partner right there on the route what to clip first, the etrier or the rope. Scott still called him a superb rock climber. They come down off the wall in the middle of June. Thexton has 18 days left to live. On the 25th of June, Broad Peak gives this expedition the summit for the first time. 4 men get up there: Afanasieff, Baxter Jones, Parkin, and Rouse. For a team working in alpine style that is already a complete success, they got up, they came down, everyone in one piece. 3 days later, on the 28th of June, a second wave goes for the summit. Scott and Sustad set off early, and at 11:30, they are standing on top. Thexton and Child start late the same day, and they move slowly, from the very beginning, slower than they need to. Scott and Sustad meet them when they are already coming down. The pair is crawling upwards, and they are still half the way from the false summit. Not the real one, the false one. Beyond it begins that ridge we talked about at the start of the video, and they will never see it. Anybody who counts time on a route understands the arithmetic at that moment. They don't have the hours, not for the climb, and not for getting back in daylight. They keep going, they stop about an hour short of the summit and turn back. The altitude under them is already around 8,000, the zone where the body only spends and recovers nothing. It's worth saying plainly here, this story often gets retold prettier than it was. The expedition report, filed by Doug Scott, puts it briefly: exhausted, they turned round an hour from the summit. Both of them turned round. Thexton made no choice between the summit and his partner. He sacrificed nothing. There simply was no strength left in either of them. From the outside, at that moment, it looked like this: an ordinary bad day for one pair against the background of a very good expedition. The mountain climbed twice in 4 days, everybody alive, and 2 men who didn't get there and are now going down. The descent began as the descent of tired men. Child was the first to go. He could barely move, couldn't hold a pace, couldn't decide for himself where to put his foot. Thexton walked beside him and drove him down, pushing him on, giving orders, not letting him sit down and stop. That's how a man behaves on a descent when he still has strength and a clear head. It went on like that for several hours, and then everything turned over. The expedition report records it in one short line. The roles were reversed. The man who had just been dragging his partner along was himself on the edge of collapse. And now it was Child, the same Child who a few hours earlier could hardly move his feet, leading Thexton down and holding him up at every step. It isn't hard to understand what happened if you remember the mechanism. While Thexton was working for 2 at around 8,000 meters, exactly the process he had studied in Khumbu on other people's patients was going on in his own lungs. There was one doctor in that pair, and he was also the sick man. After that, it's simply the descent, and it will take the whole night, the coal, the slope below it, darkness in which you see exactly as far as a head torch reaches. The last obstacle is an ice cliff about 20 meters high, directly above the tent, and it has to be got down by a man who can barely walk on his own anymore. They come down into the tent at around 7,500 meters at 2 in the morning. More than half a day has passed since Scott and Sustad met them on the way up. There are 2 men sitting in the tent, Don Willens and Gohar Shah. They had been moving at their own pace and had stopped for the night in exactly this place. Pure chance, which spared Child from being left 1-to-1 with a dying man, in exactly the position Thexton himself had been in 5 years earlier. All 4 of them look after Thexton. They give him a warm drink, and he gets better. The hope was real. A man who not long before had been hauled across the ice almost bodily comes round over a hot drink. starts answering, lies there in the warmth behind the tent walls. At 2 in the morning, at 7,500 meters, that looks like a turn for the better. The improvement was a deception. That is exactly how pulmonary edema works. Warmth and rest take away some of the signs, but don't remove the cause. The cause is altitude, and the altitude under that tent hadn't changed. Going lower in the dark with a man in that state was out of the question, and all 4 of them waited for dawn. At dawn, Thexton asked for water. There was no time to give it to him. He died before that. The expedition report records that in his last minutes there was a rattling sound in his breathing, a sign of the ödema, and no source writes about anything else. The 29th of June, 1983, 30 years old, 5 years of medical work, 18 days after a first ascent that nobody before him had made. The very illness he had studied every Himalayan season took him, in a tent with 3 men beside him, and not one means of helping him. Whether he understood at the end what was happening to him, nobody knows. It wasn't the first time he had made that diagnosis in somebody else. After that came what always has to be done at that altitude. To bring him down from 7,500, with just the 3 of them having just come through the hardest night of their lives, was impossible. Thexton was buried in a crevasse on the mountain. He has no grave, no plaque either. There is a crevasse somewhere on the flank of Broad Peak, and nobody today could point to the exact place. And down below, at base camp, Beth Akers was waiting for him. In London, there was a place that remembered him better than anywhere else. The Mountaineering Club of St. Mary's Hospital Medical School, where Thexton had been the main driving force, set up expeditions in his memory. The memorial came out strange, but surprisingly fitting. Not a stone and not a plaque. 3 expeditions. Kenya in 85, the Karakoram in 86, Peru in 87. Young medics combined climbing with research into mountain sickness, gathering data on what altitude does to the human body. That is, they were doing exactly what had occupied Thexton himself, and studying the thing he died of. In 87, in Peru, 2 of the participants died. The program was closed. Greg Child, the man who led him down the night, wrote a book, Thin Air, published in 88. There is a line in it that the book is worth remembering for. The mountains are beautiful, but they are not worth dying for. And an admission that after Broad Peak he firmly promised himself he would never go back to the Himalaya, a promise he didn't keep. The expedition of 83 lost 3 more of its 10 in the next 3 years. Roger Baxter Jones died on the 8th of July, 1985, on the north face of the Triolate, working as a guide under a collapsing serac. He was 35. Don Willens, the same man who sat in that tent that night, died in his sleep on the 4th of August, 1985, at 52. Alan Rouse, on the 4th of August, 1986, became the first Briton on the summit of K2S and never came back from it, left behind in a storm on the descent. Scott, Child, Sustad, Parkin, and Afanasieff lived longer. Of Thexton himself, nothing is left on the mountain that can be found or shown. What is left is a short entry in an expedition report, a book by the partner who got him as far as the tent, and 3 student expeditions with medical instruments in their rucksacks, and 1 more story standing apart from the mountains. On the 5th of September, 1986, the brother of the dead man, Mike Thexton, was on his way back from Pakistan, where he had spent the summer in the mountains in memory of Pete, and in Karachi, he boarded Pan Am Flight 73. The plane was hijacked. 21 people died that day. Mike was brought out to the door under threat of violence, and he said, "Please don't hurt me. My brother died in the mountains. My parents have nobody else." He was not touched. Years later, he learned from one of the hijackers that it was that phrase that saved him. On the 29th of July, 1998, 2 French climbers crawled out of a snow hole at 7,700 meters and set off for the summit of Broad Peak. They were seen once, from a neighboring slope, at 8,000 meters in a snowstorm. After that, nothing. No bodies, no tracks, no gear. Not even a theory about what happened. One of them, Éric Escoffier, was 37, and 11 years earlier he had already been written off. After an accident, half of his body no longer worked. He went back to the mountains. This is the story of exactly where he went back to. April 1984, the north face of the Grandes Jorasses. 1.5 kilometers of ice and dark granite, one of the 3 great north faces of the Alps, a place you go to as a pair, with a rope and a bivouac right there on the wall. A 23-year-old Frenchman walks up to it, alone. Soloing a face like that means one simple thing. No rope, no second person, no chance to stop and wait out a bad hour. Everything rests on not making a single mistake all day long. Éric Escoffier was born on the 9th of August, 1960, in L'Arbrel, a small town in the Rhône department. By that April morning, he is already one of the strongest climbers in France. He solos the Crow's Spur, one of the classic lines on the face. At the top, no ordinary descent down the snow slopes on the far side of the mountain is waiting for him. He unfolds a tandem hang glider and flies down to the foot of the very wall he has just climbed out of. And then he does the thing that put that day into every record book. He goes back onto the face a second time and solos the Walker Spur, the second great line of the Grandes Jorasses, 2 north faces in a single day. This was no random flash. A year earlier, he had soloed the south face of the Fou, the Bonatti route on the Grand Capucin, and the American Direct on the Douro. Each of those lines counted as an event of the season, all by itself. Then came the first solo of the Super Couloir on Mont Blanc de Tacoul, winter first ascents on the Pilier dérobé de Fresnay and in the Hyper Couloir. And in that same 84, the first winter ascent of the Slovenian route on that same north face of the Jorasses, the one he kept coming back to, the way other men come back to an office. He is 23 years old, and he is doing in the Alps just about everything that can be done in the Alps at that moment. To grasp the scale, you need one number from a neighboring discipline. On rock, Escoffier was climbing at the level of 8A, at a time when the world ceiling of difficulty was 8B+, which means he was one step away from the best pure rock climbers on the planet, and that with climbing being only part of his trade. His main tool was speed. He covered in hours what other people set aside days for, and that is exactly what made days like the one on the Jorasses possible. Speed had its flip side. A man who climbs a big wall in hours is cutting back on everything at once, on protection, on gear, on food, and on time in reserve. In his case, that was seen not as recklessness, but as style, and the style worked exactly as long as it worked. In France in the 80s, all of this turned into a public show. There were 3 of the strongest: Christophe Profit, Jean-Marc Boivin, and Escoffier. The press wrote them up like a Western and handed out the roles. Profit was the good, Boivin the ugly, Escoffier the bad. What exactly each of them had done to earn his nickname, the papers never explained, but the roles stuck, and the 3 of them were followed like a sporting championship. The main event of that championship was the Winter Trilogy, the 3 great north faces of the Alps, the Matterhorn, the Eiger, and the Grandes Jorasses, in a single winter. There was one prize, and it did not go to Escoffier. Profit did the trilogy first. In the great race of the era, Escoffier came second. Speed wasn't only his thing on the walls. He worked as a co-driver on the Monte Carlo rally, the second man in the car, the one who reads the road out loud to the driver and tells him where he doesn't have to lift off. He isn't 30 yet. He is in the best shape of his life, and his main goal lies far beyond the Alps. In the summer of 1985, Escoffier arrives in Pakistan. In 3 weeks, he does something there that no Frenchman had done before him. On the 6th of July, he climbs K2, the second highest mountain in the world, 8,611 meters. The first Frenchman in history. 9 days later, on the 15th of July, Gasherbrum 2. A week after that, on the 22nd of July, Gasherbrum 1, 8,035 and 8,080 meters, 2 neighboring mountains with a glacier and several days of travel in between. A schedule like that is only possible on a climatization you already have. A body that got used to altitude on the first mountain carries the second and the third almost without a run-up. But the price of a mistake at that pace is higher too. There is simply no time to rest between summits. 3 8,000ers in 3 weeks, in one season and in one mountain range. By the standards of the 80s, when a single mountain of that class took a 2-month expedition, it looked from the outside less like sport and more like an arithmetic error. His goal was the same as that of every top high-altitude climber of the decade, all 14 8,000ers. Back then, nobody had closed that list yet. The race was running in real time, in front of an audience, and the only way into it was with the pace Escoffier had already shown. By the age of 24, he has 3 summits out of 14, a reputation as the fastest high-altitude climber in France, and his whole career in front of him. A biography like that promises a smooth continuation. Another season, another 2 mountains, another 3. But over the next 12 years, only 2 more will be added to those 3. The Karakoram remembered 1986 for a long time. That season on K2 became the deadliest in the mountain's history. And among the dead were the strong, the experienced, the ones people thought were untouchable. Escoffier is here again that season. And this is where an episode begins that has to be flagged separately. French biographies say that in the summer of '86, he came to Broad Peak as well, the neighboring mountain which shares a base camp with K2, and that he gave up the climb. A few days earlier, one of his rope partners had died on K2. There is no direct archival confirmation of this episode. It is known only from the French life stories, and we pass it on exactly as it is written down there. The French sources give no details of that death, and we are not going to invent them. If it is true, then Broad Peak is the only mountain on his list that he walked away from himself. Not because of the weather, not because of his condition, not because an avalanche turned him back. He simply couldn't do it. For a man of that makeup, that is an event in itself. Someone who climbed north, faces solo, and back-to-back, turns around on the approach for the first time in his life. The whole Karakoram season was lost. The pause didn't last long. In October of that same year, he climbs Shishapangma. The work goes on, the count grows. There are still 10 years of career ahead, and he is completely ready for them. In reality, he has 1 year ahead of him. September 1987. The Gorge de l'Arly in Haute-Savoie, a narrow mountain road with bends above a river, the kind there are hundreds of in the French Alps. Escoffier is at the wheel. The French press would later describe his style in one phrase. He drove too fast for that road. On that road, he has an accident. He survives, but he comes back to life a different man. The diagnosis, paralysis of the left side of his body, an officially recognized disability of 35%. What that means for a climber hardly needs explaining. Half a body that on a wall does an equal share of the work. The hand that holds, the leg that stands, the shoulder that pulls. All of it stopped obeying him. How long his rehabilitation lasted, not one reliable source says. The figures going around in retellings are backed by nothing. A year later, in '88, a paragliding accident was added to all this, and it made an already difficult condition worse. Neither of these came from the mountains. A man who had survived for years on vertical walls was broken twice in a row by something other than a mountain, first a road, then a wing. About what happened to him after that, not much is publicly known. He disappeared from the magazines and the rankings about as fast as he had once appeared in them. He is 27 years old. The career of a speed climber, of that same bad out-of-the-newspaper Western, is over completely and with no way back. His contemporaries from the trio go on climbing and collecting titles, while he learns all over again how to use his own left hand. Escoffier had a line that is still quoted in France: "Better to live a short time as a lion than 150 or 200 years as a sheep." It was said at another time, and about something else. After '87, it reads differently, as the choice of a man who was offered the second option. Then come years in his life that the sources speak of sparingly, and then the list of ascents starts over. And from that list, you can see exactly how a man put himself back together. 1996, McKinley in Alaska, Kilimanjaro in Africa, and a trek to the North Pole. Not one of these objectives counts as technically hard by the standards of the old Escoffier. There is no vertical granite to climb, no need for speed. What is needed is for the body to take a long load in the cold and not give out. The North Pole isn't a climb at all. No altitude, no wall, just ice, wind, and kilometers you have to cover on foot. Each next item on that list is a little higher and a little colder than the one before. This isn't a star's schedule. It's a recovery program laid out across years and continents. 1997. Aconcagua, the highest point of South America. And in October, Cho Oyu, 8,188 meters. His first 8,000er after the accident, and his first in 11 years. On the 9th of April, 1998, he climbs Elbrus. Between what he was doing at 23 and what he is doing at 37, there is an abyss in difficulty. But the direction is the same. The 8,000er count is open again, 5 out of 14. and a man who was written off 11 years earlier is standing at the beginning of a long list once more. In the summer of '98, he goes back to the Karakoram, to the very area where in '85 he took 3 summits in 3 weeks, and to the very mountain he had walked away from in '86. The team was small. Besides Escoffier, Jean-François Lassalle was on it, and he found his rope partner through an ad in the climbing magazine, Vertical. That was how people looked for partners for a season in those years, the way you look for someone to share a long drive. Her name was Pascale Bessières, and that is almost everything we know about her. A rope partner at 8,000 meters is not a companion and not company for the road. It is a condition of survival, the person who holds the rope, pitches the tent, shares the weight, and is the first to notice that something is wrong with you. Here we have to be honest. Almost nothing has survived about the person who died beside him. Not her age, not a list of mountains, not how she came to climbing. Even the spelling of her surname wanders from source to source. She was not his life partner. What connected them was one goal for one season, and nothing more. Half of this story is a figure without a biography, and there is nothing left today to reconstruct her from. On the 28th of July, the pair spends the night high up, at roughly 7,700 meters. They spend it without bivouac gear, that is, without a tent, in a hole dug straight into the snow, under the couloir that leads out onto the summit ramp. Nights like that are called cold bivouacs, and at that altitude they cost you dearly. Over the night the body doesn't recover, it spends itself. You come out in the morning weaker than you lay down, and from there you go up already in the red. On the morning of the 29th of July, the pair leaves that bivouac and heads up. Above them waits the ridge we talked about at the start of this episode. That day the French weren't the only ones working on the mountain. A Polish pair, Piotr Pustelnik and Ryszard Pawłowski, was moving at its own pace at roughly 7,800 meters. That is where the Poles saw them for the last time. 2 people moving slowly along the ridge in a blizzard at about 8,000 meters. The Poles noted the main thing. Those 2 still had a very long way to go to the summit. Nobody saw them again. In stories like this, what usually comes next is a rescue operation, a search, an evacuation. Here, there is nothing. The Pakistani climber Ashraf Aman went up after the missing pair and came back with nothing. No tracks in the snow, no abandoned gear, no bodies. After that, the search was called off. Jean-François Lassalle came down to base camp with the Polish team and went home. The 29th of July, 1998. Éric Escoffier was 37. He would have turned 38 11 days later. There is no official version of how they died. Nobody ever put one forward. Not the expedition, not the rescuers, not the people who were on the mountain that season. The specialist site, Explorer's Web, lists this pair not among those who fell, but among those who died of exhaustion and altitude. A cold night in a snow hole, a storm the next day, a ridge at 8,000 meters. That is enough. No separate catastrophe is required. There was no analysis in the community either. There was nothing to analyze. No report of what happened up there, and no witness apart from the 2 Poles on the neighboring slope. At the start of this episode, we said that on this mountain people don't so much die as disappear. Here is the first such case on our list. This story has no scene, no witness to the last hours, no point on the map you can travel to. 2 people were moving up a ridge, and after that they are simply not there. In France, a book was written about him, Éric Escoffier, The Great Fight, and a documentary film was made, The Rage to Live. The author of the book is Jean-Michel Asselin. About her, no biography and no archive have been left, only a line in the ad she was found through. On the 18th of July, 2021, a Korean named Kim Hongbin, a man with not a single finger on either hand, stood on the summit of Broad Peak and closed out all 14 8,000ers, becoming the first person with a disability in the world to do it. The next day he broke through a cornice at 7,900 meters and ended up on an ice ledge 1 meter by 2. 15 people walked past him. A rescuer got to within 5 meters of him. His body has never been found. What follows is what happened inside those 5 meters, and why this story is still being told wrong. That day, at around 5 in the evening local time, Kim Hongbin is standing on the summit of Broad Peak. He is 56 years old, and on both hands he does not have a single finger. This detail usually gets mangled in the retellings, so let us clear it up right away. His hands themselves are intact. What was amputated is 10 fingers, every last one. His gear was rebuilt for him. Ice tools and loops were fitted to the stumps of his palms, because without fingers, there was nothing to grip with. The Korean press called him simply the climber without 10 fingers. With this summit, he closes the list of 14 8,000ers, every mountain on the planet above 8,000 meters. Before him, no person with a disability had ever completed the whole list, and after him, nobody has either. By the generally accepted count, he is the 44th person in history to do it at all. There is no single official ledger for these mountains, and everyone's tally is a little bit their own. He lives in Gwangju and heads the city's Alpine Federation. At home, they are waiting for him like a national hero. Not long to wait now. The descent, base camp, a flight. 5 in the evening is late for the top of an 8,000er. That ridge we talked about at the start of the episode is one he now has to cross back the other way, with the day already running out. The descent begins that same evening. On the 19th of July, Kim Hongbin disappears, and he has never been found since. Between those 2 days, there are a few hours and one narrow ice ledge. But this disappearance has a peculiarity. There was no emptiness here. Kim was seen. People were coming to him all through the first half of the day. One man got to within 5 meters of him and shouted right into his face. This is a story about help that arrives in time and still does not help. 30 years earlier, on the other side of the world, he had already waited for rescuers once. 1991, Alaska, Denali, the highest point of North America, 6,190 meters. Not the tallest mountain, but one of the coldest on the planet, almost at the Arctic Circle, where the cold works the way it works on a Himalayan summit. Kim goes up alone, in light style, which means no team, no camp stocked in advance, and almost no margin for error. The error happens. It takes rescuers 16 hours to get him off the mountain. He regains consciousness 10 days later. Then come 7 operations back to back, and after them, not one finger is left on his hands. For a climber, that usually means the end of the biography. Fingers are the one thing a person holds onto a mountain with. For 6 years, he climbs nothing at all. What happened to him in those years, Korean sources describe sparingly. All we know is how they ended. In 1997, he comes back and starts again, from Elbrus. A year later, in 98, he flies to Alaska once more and climbs Denali, the very mountain that took his fingers. It is not a record and not a sporting result. Thousands of people had climbed Denali by then. It is simply a debt settled. Equipment had to be adapted for him. Everything an ordinary person does with fingers in a second, buckling, clipping, tying a knot, he had to solve some other way, through modified gear, in thick mittens, in the cold. Every small thing like that cost him time and strength. And at altitude, there is never any spare of either. He had a line that people in Korea still quote, "Dreams are bigger than life. Life can be poor, but you cannot give up the dream." That was said by a man who had already paid the price for it. He opens his 8,000er account late. The first mountain is Gasherbrum II in 2006, when he is already past 40. A year later, Everest. After that, the list grows unevenly with long pauses. K2 in 2012, Manaslu in 14, Nanga Parbat, and Lhasa in 17, Annapurna in 18. The whole road from the first summit to the 14th took 15 years. For comparison, the strongest high-altitude climbers of the last 2 decades closed this list in 7 or 8 years, and record attempts are now counted in months. Kim went slowly, 1 mountain a season, sometimes 1 in 2. All 14 summits he did with oxygen. That is worth saying straight out, because in climbing arguments, this point always comes up. In his case, oxygen was not a concession. It was a way to cut the risk of new frostbite. When there is not enough oxygen, the body stops warming the extremities first. In 2009, Kim also closed the 7 summits, the highest points of every continent. That combination, both lists at once, had never been done by a person with a disability before, either. Between expeditions, he competed for Korea's Paralympic team in cross-country skiing and cycling. He was born in Gohung County in South Jeolla Province, in the south of the country. Gwangju became his home later, in adult life. By the summer of 2021, there was one unclosed line left on the list, Broad Peak, A mountain usually counted among the easier ones on that list, which is exactly why it often gets left for last. That season's expedition was the final item in a 15-year plan. Back home in Korea, they were following it closely. The record was only a few days of climbing away. It is not only the Korean team working on the ridge that evening. On the 18th of July, several groups from different countries go up at once. The usual picture for a short Karakoram weather window. Kim reaches the summit at around 5 in the evening and turns straight back down. The key place on the descent is a snow cornice above the col at about 7,900 meters. A cornice is a lip of snow blown up by the wind, hanging over a drop with nothing underneath it. From above it looks like the slope simply continues. In reality, there is empty space under your feet, covered by a few centimeters of packed snow. The first person to break through that lip is not Kim. Shortly before him, the Russian climber Anastasia Runova goes through in the same spot. The rope holds her, she hangs in the hole, and for about 2 hours, 2 men hold her from above, Oswald Pereira and Stefan Keck. Runova gets out by herself, having lost a crampon in her ascender. Those 2 hours change the situation along the whole section. The main rope is occupied by a person hanging on it. A queue builds up. People are freezing in the dark. According to the Belgian climber, Sophie Leenaerts, it was precisely because the main rope was occupied that Kim decided to move over to another one that was in bad condition. Then he breaks through in exactly the same place she did. The difference is that nothing holds him. He goes under the cornice about 15 meters, onto the Chinese side of the ridge, the side away from the route and the camps. The fall is stopped by an ice ledge. Its size is roughly 1 meter by 2. The wall around it runs at about 70 degrees, and the section he came off is closer to 80, which means he is lying on the only horizontal scrap of ground for hundreds of meters up and down. There was nothing on that wall to grab onto without fingers. Sophie Leenaerts put it briefly. He could not get out of there on his own. All that was left was to wait. And up above, at that moment, nobody yet understood who exactly had fallen or where. From here, the story is easier to count in hours because all of it is about lost time. At around 11 at night on the 18th of July, the group led by the Russian climber Vitaly Lazo turns back from the foresummit and heads down. At midnight, a distress signal goes out over the radio, but it concerns a different person. At 1 in the morning, Lazo and his partner Anton Pugovkin turn around and go back up, after their own failed summit attempt without rest. At 4 in the morning, they meet Runova coming down, and only by 5 in the morning does the correct information reach the upper slopes. The man who fell is Kim Hongbin, and he is on the Chinese side. Up to that moment, the rescuers had spent about 4 hours searching in the wrong place. Those 4 hours at nearly 8,000 meters at night came at a high price. They drained the strength of everyone who was on the mountain. Lazo later made a separate charge in public, and it weighs more than any technical detail. According to him, no fewer than 15 people walked past Kim as he lay there. Yes, it was dark, but the light of his headlamp was definitely visible. According to Lazo, the people on the route had satellite trackers and radios, and passing a position down would have taken 1 minute, yet nobody did it. The explanation is probably simple. Everyone walking past was busy with their own hard descent in the dark, and a stranger's small light off to the side did not add up to a picture. Kim spent more than 9 hours on that ledge before anyone even saw him, and about 14 hours there in total, alone. And all that time, he was conscious and coming up on the radio. Korean papers ran his last words over the radio as a headline. Just 4 words. I survived the night. Very cold. He did survive the night. On the morning of the 19th of July, 2 men were finally on their way to him, the same 2 who had headed back up at 1 in the morning and had not stopped since. At 10:53 in the morning, Lazo sees him, a small figure on a ledge under the cornice, noticeably off to the side of the line of the route. Rigging a descent down to him alone, on a 70-degree wall, takes still more time. Lazo stops 5 meters above him and starts shouting. Kim does not look his way. He is jerking about, trying to do something with his gear, with the ropes, with his own position on the ledge. What exactly was happening in those seconds only became clear afterwards, from Lazo's own analysis. Kim was climbing the rope on a jumar, a clamp that slides freely up a rope and bites down hard on it under a downward load. The jumar jammed. Because of that, Slack formed in the main line, a sagging, unloaded stretch of rope. Lazo spotted it from above. Kim unclipped from the jam clamp to free himself and move on to the other ropes hanging right there. Old ones, Korean, polypropylene, no knots, of unknown age. And at that moment, the slack snapped taut. There was a shock load, a short, sharp force that a worn-out rope cannot take. The old Korean rope broke. This is the crucial point, because in the retellings it sounds completely different, as if Kim had unclipped from the rescue rope himself and let himself go, so as not to drag anyone else down with him. Nothing of the kind happened. The man was working his way out of a jammed system, and the equipment failed. At around 2 in the afternoon, he goes down the wall, horizontal, with torn pieces of rope on his legs. Lazo says that with 99% probability, he died instantly. Pugovkin came up at 1:30, shortly before the fall. After that, the two of them had nothing left to do but save themselves. At 5:20, they started down, and a little after 9 in the evening, they reached base camp. By then, both their own lives were hanging by the same thread. In Seoul, that day they were still celebrating. On the 19th of July, President Moon Jae-in publicly congratulated Kim on closing out all 14 8,000ers. Korean outlets ran subheadings about hope for a weary nation. It was the second year of the pandemic, and good news was in short supply. A few hours after the congratulations came the report of his disappearance. The country learned about the record and about the disaster practically on the same day. From the 20th of July, Pakistani Army Aviation joined the search. On the 25th of July, a helicopter made 6 passes over the 7,900-meter mark. No trace was found. China sent 2 helicopters in from its side of the ridge, since Kim had fallen onto their territory. Here it is worth taking down one persistent myth. Popular retellings say the helicopter was never sent up because there was no insurance. That is not true. The helicopters flew, and not for just one day. The reason is a different one, and it is physical. No machine in the world can lift a person off 7,900 meters. The air at that altitude is too thin. The rotor has nothing to push against. The practical ceiling for rescue work in the Himalaya and the Karakoram lies noticeably lower, and everything above that, rescuers carry on their own backs. The search ran for 8 days, coordinated from base camp by Don Bowie. On the 26th of July, the work was called off at the family's request. His wife explained it by the risk of further accidents, and quoted her husband's own words. "I went to the mountains thanks to the help of the people around me. I do not want to be a burden even after death. I want to be buried in the mountains." While Kim was being searched for, another long-standing story on Broad Peak came to an end. Rescuers found and identified a Korean climber who had gone missing here 22 years earlier, in 1999, and returned him to his homeland. In August 2021, he was decorated posthumously. The Cheongnyongjong, the Blue Dragon, the highest class of the Korean Order of Sporting Merit. In December of the same year, he was inducted into the Korean Sports Hall of Fame. Gwangju applied to have his personal belongings recognized as a provisional cultural heritage object, a rare status for an athlete's equipment. Every year, the city holds a memorial ceremony, and 3 years after the mountain, this story got a sequel nobody was expecting, a legal one. In 2024 and 25, Korea's Ministry of Justice recovered the costs of the rescue operation. The Seoul Central District Court ordered the Gwangju Alpine Federation to pay $25 million, one for the use of the Pakistani Army helicopter. That is about $19,000. Another $10 million won the court recovered from 5 of his teammates for transport from base camp to Skardu. The ministry had demanded the full amount, $68 million won, and appealed the court's decision. Formally, everything here is by the law. The state recovers the costs it has incurred from the organizers of an expedition, the way it is set up in many countries. At the same time, the bill for the search for a man his country had declared a national hero went to his own team, the same people who had spent 8 days looking for him. Most of the stories on this mountain have neither a witness nor a point on the map. This one has both. The hour is known, the altitude is known, and so is the man who stood 5 meters away and saw it all with his own eyes. There is even a cause, a specific technical one, said out loud, an old rope and a shock load. Only Kim Hongbin himself is missing. He stayed on the Chinese side of the ridge, under that same cornice, in a place from which a person cannot be brought back, not by helicopter and not by hand. And that was exactly what he had asked for. We know less about Sharif Sadpara than about anyone else in this episode. There's no book, no documentary, no long interview, no archive of photographs. There isn't even a coherent biography. Where he studied, when he first went into the mountains, how he ended up in the job. There's an age, 34. There's a profession, high-altitude porter, one of those Pakistanis without whom not a single commercial expedition in the Karakoram would function. There's the name attached to his own, Sadpara, after a village near Skardu. Earlier in this episode, we already said that this isn't a family surname, and no source confirms that the people who carry it are related. There's one confirmed climb. In the summer of 2021, he went up K2. For a porter, that's the top line on a resume. The hardest mountain in the region, Broad Peak's closest neighbor. And there are 5 children. In the summer of 2022, he's working for a British company, Impact Ascents. It was founded by Pete Brittleton and Paul Etheridge, and it sells 8,000er climbs to clients who pay for an organized summit push. In that arrangement, Sharif is top-grade labor. He carries loads, sets up camps, fixes ropes, and goes up ahead of the clients so that the clients have something to follow. This is work with the order of risk reversed. The client steps onto the route when everything is already prepared. The ropes are hanging, the tents are up, the trail is broken. The porter covers that same section earlier, and more than once, with a load on his back, on a slope nobody has touched yet. He goes higher and earlier than anyone else, and as a rule, his name doesn't show up in the summit statistics. That's exactly why so little trace of these people is left. Hundreds see them on the route, and in the write-ups of expeditions they come through as a single line. The local team. What follows is the only stretch of his life described in any detail. It takes up one morning, 1 hour of that morning, to be precise. Everything else has to be reconstructed from other people's accounts, from his employer's press release, from the stories of climbers on a neighboring team, from short notes in the specialist press. A man about whom there's almost no information left behind, a few very precisely documented seconds. Those seconds begin with an ordinary working night. The 4th of July turns into the 5th. It's dark and windy at Camp 3 on Broad Peak, and the team from the Austrian outfit, Furtenbach Adventures, is getting ready for the push. They set out at night. They always do, so there's time to go up and come back down in daylight. The first group has a double job, not just to get there, but to fix the ropes. These are the lines anchored to the slope and left hanging so that everyone coming behind can clip in and move faster and more safely. Whoever fixes the ropes is working for the whole mountain. Behind Furtenbach's group, others come up the ropes that are already in place. Sharif Sadpara is among them. That's how any big day on an 8,000er works. The ones breaking trail go out in front, the rest string out behind them, and the whole caravan depends on a few hundred meters of somebody else's rope. The weather that night is bad. There's a storm on the ridge, not a middling snowfall, but an actual storm, the kind where visibility drops to a few meters and the wind knocks you off your stride. In conditions like that, fixed ropes stop being a convenience and become the only way of knowing where you are. The Austrians run the ropes up to the summit ridge and stop there. Above that begins the narrow ridge between the 2 summits we talked about at the start of the episode. Beyond it, there are no fixed lines. There's snow, wind, and a strip where each person walks for himself. Morning on an 8,000er is arranged simply and harshly. You get a window of a few hours. Any earlier, it's too dark and too cold. Any later, there isn't enough daylight left for the descent. Whatever you don't finish inside that window, you'll be finishing in the dark and on the last of your strength. So, on the 5th of July, people go up despite the wind. And every hour they decide, all over again, whether it's worth going on. Dawn comes around 4 in the morning. By 5, people are at roughly 8,020 meters. There isn't far left to the top. The wind isn't easing, but so far nobody is turning back. The ridge Sharif is moving along at this point looks solid from the outside. A flat white strip, packed snow, the tracks of the ones who went ahead. But every high ridge has a property you can't see from above. The snow the wind carries across the crest doesn't stop at the line of the rock. It's carried further, out past the edge, and it sets in midair as an overhang. What you get is a cornice, A snow balcony hanging over the drop with nothing supporting it. From above, it's indistinguishable from solid ground. Underneath it, there's nothing at all. About an hour after dawn, around 5 in the morning, at some 8,020 meters, the snow platform under Sharif Sadpara gives way. It doesn't sag, it doesn't crack, it doesn't leave a second to jump clear. It goes all at once, together with the person standing on it. The broken piece of cornice drops away down the Chinese side of the mountain, where the drop is around 2 kilometers. This happens in front of other people. The fall is seen by climbers from a neighboring team, Michael Lutz and the guide Ulysses Corvalán. Both are close enough to understand exactly what has happened and far enough away to have not the slightest chance of stepping in. Cornices are an old and well-known danger, and there's almost no defense against them. You can work out where the solid ridge ends only from indirect signs, and in a storm, with visibility of a few meters, those signs can't be read at all. People walk in the tracks of the ones before them, and what held 10 of them yesterday can break off under one today. An experienced high-altitude climber knows everything there is to know about cornices, and that knowledge doesn't save him. He still has to walk where the ridge goes. There's no slip here, no error, no struggle, no wrong step, no badly tied knot, no unclipped carabiner, not even the few seconds it would take to try to self-arrest with an axe. A man was standing, and what he was standing on was gone. The height of the fall did the rest. There was nobody left to rescue. No operation was started because there was nothing to start. Nobody survives 2 kilometers. Sharif Sadpara's body was never brought down. Other people are still on the ridge at that moment. For them, the morning ends too, just differently. The leader of the Austrian expedition, Lucas Furtenbach, later puts it briefly, "After what happened, everyone called off the push. Not one team, not two. Everyone who was going up that day." Michael Lutz explains his decision in a single sentence. "In a storm like that, I didn't dare go on without ropes." There's nothing heroic in it and nothing cowardly. It's simple arithmetic. Above the point where the fixed lines ended, there was nothing to climb on, visibility was almost zero, and right before that, a piece of the ridge had broken away in front of everyone. Any step forward turned into a bet. Usually in the mountains, an accident is followed by work. Someone goes down to the casualty, someone passes word down by radio, someone gathers people to come up with ropes and a stretcher. Here none of that happened, and none of it could have. No descent to the casualty, no attempt to reach him, no long hours at the edge, nothing at all of what's called a rescue. People turned around and went down, to Camp 3. Calling off a summit day on an 8,000er is an expensive decision. Teams pay for a window of good weather, with weeks of waiting at base camp, with clients' money, and with a reserve of strength that doesn't come back at that altitude. Turning around not far below the top means all that work has to start over, or won't happen at all. On the 5th of July, everyone turned around, and they all made that decision within the same hour. The mountain gave up nothing that day. There are no last words, no last radio call, no place you can come to and leave something. There's an altitude, a time, and 2 witnesses who watched a man disappear. The whole story of Sharif Sadpara on Broad Peak fits into the stretch between dawn and 5 in the morning. Not days of fighting at 8,000 meters, not a night without a tent, not a week of searching. An hour of ordinary work, and the few seconds that cut it short. While the climbers are coming down to the tents, thousands of kilometers from the Karakoram, a text is being put together. Sharif's employer, the company Impact Descents, publishes a statement about the results of the day. It says that, on the 5th of July, 2022, at 14 minutes past 5, 5 Impact Descents members reached the summit of Broad Peak, becoming the first team of the season. The death of Sharif Sadpara is mentioned lower down, on a separate line. The order of those 2 pieces of news was noticed straight away. First the success, then the man. For the climbing community, where news travels through the same handful of sites and chats, that sequence sounded like a statement of priorities, and people began discussing it. The wording, "first team of the season," is not an empty phrase in commercial high-altitude climbing. It's a line for the website, for next year's advertising, for the client deciding who to hand their money to for a climb. In early July, the mountain is still almost untouched, and whoever claims the first success takes all the attention of the season. So, the price of a claim like that isn't measured in words alone. Then more serious questions were added to the discussion. Explorer's Web, one of the main specialist outlets covering high-altitude climbing, cast doubt on the claimed ascent itself. Its arguments were not emotional, but factual, and the outlet listed them in order. First argument. According to Explorer's Web, above the point where the fixed lines ended, there were no ropes, meaning that on the hardest section of the ridge, there was nothing to hold on to. Second, the outlet pointed out that a storm was blowing at the time, the kind that had teams turning back that day. Third, according to the same outlet, nobody at all has a confirmed ascent of Broad Peak on the 5th of July, 2022. And there was one more detail, small-looking and awkward in substance. 14 minutes past 5, is that morning or evening? The statement gives the time without specifying. If it's morning, it almost coincides with the moment of the death. If it's evening, then the ascent took place half a day after the push had, by the participants' own accounts, been called off by everyone. No clarification on this point has ever appeared in open sources. The complaints didn't end there. The company's actions after what happened were also judged critically in the community. The tone of the official statement was called inappropriate, and the sharpest voices called it cynical. Those are heavy words, and they can't be repeated as a verdict. This is the position of part of the community, not an established fact. There was no inquiry, no commission, and no official finding in this story. Nor is there any response from impact ascents to the questions raised in open sources. No denial, no explanation, no clarification of the time. None of it has appeared since 2022. It's worth saying separately what definitely did not happen in this story, because the confusion here comes up constantly. That same summer of 2022, another Pakistani mountain guide died in the Karakoram in early July in a glacial crevasse. He's sometimes put in the same line as Sharif Sadpara, but that was a different mountain, a different expedition, and a different story. It has nothing to do with Broad Peak. It's the same with everything else. Whether Sharif Sadpara's family received any compensation at all, the sources don't confirm. Whether there was an official reaction from Pakistani climbing organizations, also no. Whether he climbed other 8,000ers besides K2E, there's no data. All that can honestly be said is unknown. Two facts remain, and both are short. A 34-year-old man was walking along a ridge at about 8,020 meters, and the snow under him gave way, and 5 children were left without a father. There are 10 stories in this episode, and in almost every one, there's something to take hold of. The last hours, an attempted rescue, a long argument, a search, someone's decision you can debate. Here there's none of that. No struggle, no choice, no mistake you could take apart and say, this is where it should have gone differently. There's only a mountain that stopped being solid for a second. This is the shortest segment of the episode. And its brevity isn't a shortage of material. It's the exact shape of what happened. A life ended just as quickly as this account does. On the 28th of July, 1975, 5 Polish climbers stood on a summit where no one had stood before them, the central summit of Broad Peak, about 8,011 meters. A day and a half later, 2 of them came back down. Between those 2 facts, there is a rope left below for the sake of speed, a night on the col under a sheet of emergency foil, and a slope of hard ice where everyone who crossed it fell. This is the first tragedy in the history of the mountain. Before these names, its list of victims was empty, and it began with a decision that, on the way up, looked completely sensible. On the 2nd of May, 1975, a truck pulls out of Wrocław. In the back are tents, ropes, crampons, tinned food, and 15 people who intend to ride it all the way to Pakistan. The drive takes 3 weeks. They reach Islamabad on the 21st of May, leaving behind some 9,000 kilometers of asphalt, dirt roads, and border posts. A plane would have been faster, but in socialist Poland in the 70s, climbers have almost no hard currency at all, and they sew and rivet their own gear. Everything saved on the road goes into the mountain. The expedition was put together by the Wrocław Mountaineering Club, Klub Wysokogórski Wrocław. Janusz Fereński is in charge, with Kazimierz Głazek as his deputy. Their objective is not the obvious one. They are not going for the main summit of Broad Peak, which the Austrians took years earlier, and not for the 4 summit either. What interests them is the 3rd point of the massif, the central summit, a separate dome to the north of the main one, with its own ridge and its own way out. No one has ever climbed it. In height, it gives up about 40 meters to the main summit, but you have to go at it separately. Its own climb, its own ridge, its own descent. In the world record books, a point like that counts as an objective in its own right, and a first ascent of it is credited on its own, not as an add-on to the peak next door. For the Poles, the stakes are higher than they look from the outside. By 1975, there is not a single conquered 8,000er in the country. There is a school, there are winter routes in the Tatras, there are people who climb as well as any Western star. But on the main list of world mountaineering, Poland simply does not appear. An ascent of an unclimbed summit above 8,000 meters would close that gap in a single move. They will bring it home, and they will pay so much for it that there will be no one left to celebrate. Base camp goes up on the 30th of June, at about 5,000 meters. After that comes the ordinary siege work of those years. A chain of camps built over weeks, hauling loads from the bottom upward and coming back down to sleep lower. The first camp goes in at roughly 5,790 meters, the second at 6,500. They did not invent the layout. 18 years earlier, the Austrians went up this same slope, and the placement of their camps is written down in the reports. The Poles repeat it, but push every point about 150 meters higher. The logic is simple. The higher the top camp sits, the shorter the summit day. Camp 3 ends up at 7,200 meters. That is where they will set out from. Working on that chain is 28-year-old Bohdan Nowacek. He was born on the 15th of February 1947, graduated from the Wrocław University of Technology, and works as an electronics engineer. In the mountains, he is neither a beginner nor a weekend man. Between 1972 and 1974, he puts up a series of routes recorded in the Polish chronicles as First Polish Ascents, in the Tatras, in the Alps, in the Dolomites, in the Caucasus. Among them, the wall of Punta Civita in the Dolomites. 3 years running, season after season, he builds himself a reputation as a man you can trust with a hard pitch. In those years, the phrase First Polish Ascent meant something very simple. The line had already been laid down by Western climbers, and the Poles followed it and proved they were just as good. Broad Peak was a chance to finally go first, not in somebody else's tracks. On an expedition like this, that is the real currency. Not titles and not publications, but who your partners are willing to put last on the descent, the place where there is no one left above to hold you. In the summer of '75, Nowacek has less than a month to live. On the 28th of July, at around 3 in the morning, 6 men leave Camp 3. It is dark, it is cold, and the cold between the summits is several hours of snow and ice above them. They travel light as anything can be at that altitude. Every extra kilogram at 8,000 meters turns into lost minutes, and they have exactly as many minutes as the daylight lasts. The first loss happens before they even reach the col. Roman Babak turns around and goes back down. Why? Neither the American report nor the Polish sources say. The reason he turned back is recorded nowhere. He descends to camp, and a day later, that will matter. Down below, there will be a man with the strength to climb up toward them. 5 carry on. Bohdan Nowacek, Marek Kęsicki, Andrzej Sikorski, Kazimierz Głazek, and Janusz Kulisz. 5 instead of 6. At that altitude, this is not arithmetic. It is the difference in how many hands are nearby if something goes wrong up top. About 300 meters below the col, they make the decision that generations of Polish climbers will go on picking apart. The group is carrying an 80-meter rope, a few kilograms that somebody has to haul uphill all day. On the snow slope, it has not been needed once. To move faster, they leave it in a rucksack right there on the slope. They will pick it up on the way back. Only one rope goes up with them. The second one, the shorter one. In the logic of the ascent, that is reasonable. Speed at 8,000 meters is a question of survival, and extra weight takes it away directly. In the logic of the descent, it is a mistake, and the price of it will become clear 17 hours later. The col lies at 7,850 meters. From there, it is not far to the central summit, but that climb eats up their entire day. At about 7:30 in the evening, all 5 of them stand on a summit no human being has ever reached. The exact time varies. The American Alpine Journal gives 7:30, while Głazek himself, in the Polish version, says 7:15. 15 minutes changes nothing. At the end of July, At that latitude, the sun is already going down by then, and they arrived on top essentially in twilight. What should have been a triumph looks routine and rushed. They leave a canister with the names of the team on the summit, standard practice for the era, documentary proof of the ascent. It is a metal box with a note inside: who came up, when, and by which route. The next team, if one ever gets here, is supposed to find it and carry it down. They look around, the weather is turning, and you can see it with the naked eye. They spend a matter of minutes on the summit. Formally, at that moment, the expedition's job is done. The central summit of Broad Peak has been climbed for the first time in history, and Poles did it. The first 8,000-meter summit in the history of Polish mountaineering has been taken, the very thing the country had never had. But between taking the summit and coming back from the summit, there is a distance here that nobody measured in advance. Below them is the col, beyond it a steep drop, then a long slope down to Camp 3. In daylight, that is a hard but passable route. They started in the dark, on headlamps, after 17 hours of work, at an altitude where the brain thinks more slowly than it does at sea level. The descent begins almost immediately. The first steep section calls for a rappel, a descent on a fixed rope, the one rope they have left. A rappel is a simple arrangement, and all its danger is in that simplicity. You run the rope behind a projection or clip it to an anchor, double it, go down on it, and at the bottom you pull one end and take it down with you. Whoever goes last works without a rope from above. He strips the anchor behind him, and he has to be certain the rope is set absolutely solid. Now watch it goes last. The rope slips. The report published in the American Alpine Journal puts it briefly and without comment. Nowacek was lost when his rappel rope came adrift and plunged down the Chinese side. This was their only rope. 4 men are left above. They shout into the darkness and shine their lamps into the drop. At that depth, the beam reaches nothing. There is no answer. The Chinese side is the opposite flank of the massif, facing Xinjiang. From the ridge you do not go down there, and you do not come up from there. You only fall there. None of them saw where exactly he went, and none of them will be able to point to the place on a map afterward. There is no point, no trace, no direction to search in. The mountain took him along with the equipment that was holding the whole group together, because the second part of that sentence means more than the first. They have no rope now, not one. The 80-meter rope is lying in a rucksack 300 meters below the col, that is, beyond the pass, below the section that cannot be passed without a rope in the first place. To get their hands on it, they would first have to get through the very place it was needed for. Going further down in the dark, unroped, after a full day on their feet, is certain death. They stay where they are and wait for daylight. Right there, on a col swept by wind from both sides, 4 men have to get through a night with no tent and no sleeping bags. All they have is emergency foil, the thin metallized sheet that today sits in every hiker's first aid kit. It reflects part of your body heat back at you and does nothing beyond that. A sheet like that weighs a few dozen grams and folds into a pocket, which is exactly why you carry it for a case like this. But it is designed for a few hours of waiting for help, not for a whole night in the wind at nearly 8,000 meters. At that altitude, a night like that is not rest, it is expenditure. The body does not recover, it only spends what is left. Heat, water, oxygen, strength. Every hour above 7,500 meters without food or drink is subtracted from the reserve a man still needs to walk down on. In the morning, they will be weaker than they were in the evening, and that is the one thing known for certain. There is nobody to wait for up here. Above Camp 3 there are no people, and the only way down to them is on your own 2 feet. The weather does not improve overnight. On the 29th of July, the 4 of them start down. The first thing to solve is what to belay with. There is no rope, and so they do what people do when they have no choice left. They take their own equipment apart. Personal slings, harnesses, waist belts, anything that can be tied together goes into it. What comes out is a cord about 25 meters long, thin, made of mismatched pieces, with knots every few meters. For 4 men, that homemade cord is all there is, and nothing else, on a descent from 8,000 meters. As protection, it barely works at all. It is more of a gesture, an attempt to keep at least the illusion of a system where the system is already gone. With that, they step onto the ice. Below the col, the slope changes. The snow they came up on the day before has been scoured and frozen out by morning, and what is under the crampons is hard ice. the kind the points do not bite into, they only scratch the surface. On ice like that, you move on your front points, placing each foot carefully, belayed by a rope through ice screws. They have none of that. They go unroped, not as a rope team, just 4 people on one slope, each on his own. A homemade cord over that distance solves nothing. Tying 4 men into it would guarantee that whoever slipped would drag the rest with him. All 3 of them slip. Kensitsky, Sikorsky, and Kulish, one after another, at different moments, on different sections. The mechanics are the same every time. A foot goes, the body picks up speed within seconds, and everything after that depends on whether you manage to roll onto your stomach, drive the pick of your axe into the ice, and hang on it. The technique is called self-arrest, and it is drilled back in mountaineering school on gentle snow slopes. On hard ice, it works far from always. The pick does not go into the surface, it skates across it, and the man only accelerates. Kulish manages it. He arrests himself, stops the fall, and stays on the slope. Kensitsky and Sikorsky could not stop. Gwazek, the deputy leader of the expedition, turns out to be the senior man among those still on their feet. In less than a day, the group has gone from 5 people to 2. Up at the summit canister, there were 5 of them. Now, on the ice below the col, there are Gwazek and Kulish, and they still have a long way down. On the same ice, in the same crampons, with no rope. They have to keep descending. There is simply no other way out of here. Gwazek and Kulish spend their second cold night lower down the route. 2 days without proper sleep, without a tent, almost without water. By this point, both of them have frostbite, and every next step costs more than the last. Frostbite at altitude creeps up quietly. The fingers get cold first, then stop feeling anything. And it seems to the man that it has got easier. Both of them will make it to the bottom, and both will carry that frostbite home. Men are coming up to meet them. Roman Babok, the one who turned back below the col a day earlier, and Jan Yuskevich climb the route and meet the 2 survivors. That turnaround, whose reason nobody wrote down, turned out to be the only reason there was anyone in camp with the strength to go up. Then the search begins, and here the story splits into 3 separate fates. The body of Andrei Sikorsky is found about 100 meters below the site of the second bivouac. That is, not far, within sight of the route they had come down. Marek Kensitsky is searched for in the couloirs of the west face. Couloirs are the gullies in the rock down which everything that comes off the slope above goes. He is not found. Bohdan Nowacek is not searched for at all. There is nowhere to search. He went down the other side of the mountain, into terrain you cannot reach from this route. Of the 3 who died, the mountain gave back 1. 2 Polish climbers were not found in 75 and were not found later. And on the list of this mountain's victims, they stand with no place of death, only a date. Before they break down base camp, the members of the expedition find a suitable boulder and carve 3 names into it. Bohdan Nowacek, Marek Kensitsky, Andrzej Sikorsky. No grave, no cross, no plaque. A stone on the glacier that will stay here after everyone is gone. On the 5th of August, the camp comes down, and the expedition starts the long road home, the same one, only in reverse. Formally, they are taking back to Poland exactly what they came for, a confirmed first ascent and a place in the world mountaineering record. The report on it will go into the American Alpine Journal, and what remains for history is one dry line: the summit was climbed. Radio Wrocław ran its report on the expedition's return under a headline that would be quoted for decades. The feat was there, the joy was not. That is how Poland remembers 1975, as the moment the country entered high-altitude mountaineering and, in the same week, learned what it costs. Here the triumph and the disaster turned out to be literally the same event. Not, they climbed it, and then something happened on the way down, but exactly this. A summit no one had ever set foot on took 3 of the 5 who climbed it within the next day and a half. And one more thing. Before the 28th of July, 1975, nobody had died on Broad Peak. For 18 years after the first ascent, the mountain took nothing. Its list of victims, the same one that would later hold Britons, Frenchmen, Italians, Austrians, Koreans, and Pakistanis, begins with these 3 names on a boulder at its foot. The central summit has been visited very rarely since. Almost nobody has wanted to repeat their route. On the 18th of July, 2009, a 31-year-old nurse from just outside Vicenza is standing on the summit ridge of Broad Peak. Between her and the main summit lies that one short ridge, and for her, it is already out of reach. A few minutes after the group turns back down, Cristina Castagna will slip 10 meters ahead of her partner. Her body is still on the mountain, not because it could not be brought down. The reason had been written out in advance on a sheet of paper left at home, and signed with the nickname she had been called since childhood. Valdagno is a small industrial town in the province of Vicenza, right at the edge of the Little Dolomites. On the 23rd of December, 1977, Cristina Castagna is born here. Her village is called San Quirico. It sits above the town, and the mountains are visible straight from its windows. By profession, Cristina is an emergency room nurse. It is shift work, where death is not an abstract idea, but part of the working day. People who knew her remember a small woman who talked fast and almost never went quiet. That is where the nickname came from, the one that stuck to her for life, El Grillo. In the Venetian dialect, it means cricket. Her home mountain is Monte Carrega, a peak in the Little Dolomites with a cross on top that can be seen from the valley. Every climber in Italy has a mountain like that. Not a record, not a goal, just a place you go for no particular reason. Dozens of times, in any weather. Cristina belongs to the local branch of the Alpini Association in Valdagno. She writes poems and reads a lot. On an expedition, a book takes up space that could have gone to food. Between trips to the big mountains, she keeps coming back to Carrega. Her whole life from then on is built out of that combination. Shifts in the emergency room and 8,000ers packed into the same calendar. A Himalayan expedition takes a month and a half to 2 months. For a professional climber, that is work. For a nurse at a district hospital, it is a year's worth of saved-up leave, plus her own money. Vacation is counted in days, and in her case, those days always went in one direction, to the Himalaya and the Karakoram. Cristina Castagna was never a professional, in the sense that any of the men whose names thundered at 8,000 meters in those years were. She simply left for the mountains, and then came back to her shifts. 2004, Tibet. Cristina is 27, and she climbs Shishapangma, the lowest of the 14 8,000ers, and traditionally the first one in the career of anybody who plans to go further. Here, we need to be precise, because Shishapangma, like the mountain this episode is about, has more than one summit. Cristina stands on the central summit, 8,013 meters. Beyond it lies a ridge that, in those years, plenty of people who claimed the ascent never actually crossed. Formally, the altitude is taken. She becomes the youngest Italian woman to climb above 8,000 meters. That title is the one that stays with her. In the Italian climbing press, it will be repeated every time her name comes up, including in the obituaries 5 years later. The following summer, in 2005, she leaves for the Karakoram and climbs Gasherbrum II. This is Pakistan now, the Baltoro Glacier, and it is her first acquaintance with the region where she will die. For Italians, the Karakoram is almost home ground. Their expeditions have been coming here ever since K2 in 1954. Her list of 8,000ers looks uneven from the very start. In one place, the main point. In another, the neighboring one. In a third, the expedition ends in a turnaround. That is what the biography of almost any high-altitude climber looks like when the person is not chasing records but simply going. The trouble is that later, when people start writing obituaries about this woman, the list gets straightened out. Round numbers are more convenient. Between 2 expeditions, there is ordinary life. The emergency room, night shifts, the drive down from San Quirico to the hospital. She has no sponsorship contract, no team of managers, and no obligations to gear manufacturers. Every season of hers in the Himalaya is paid for out of a nurse's leave and a nurse's salary. That is exactly why her mountains always come in pairs. Once you have made the trip, you take 2 at once. 1 journey, 2 chances. A permanent rope partner in high-altitude climbing is not found quickly and is not found often. Cristina got lucky. Hers is Giampaolo Casarotto, a climber from the same Vicenza, with 6 8,000ers behind him. The surname can be confusing here. Renato Casarotto grew up in the same area, the famous Italian climber who died on K2 in 1986. Giampaolo simply shares the name. Not a single source confirms a family connection either way. Both from Vicenza, both climbers, That was enough for retellings to keep filing them into one family. In 2007, Cristina and Giampaolo climbed Dhaulagiri, the two of them, without oxygen. Not as part of a big commercial expedition with a crowd on the fixed ropes, but just the two of them, their own rope team. The way it is done by people who trust each other more than they trust a schedule. Two people on an 8,000er means there will be no help other than your partner, on the way up or the way down. A year later, in 2008, she goes to Makalu, the fifth highest mountain on the planet, and one of the meanest by turnaround statistics. Without oxygen again. No Italian woman had stood on the summit of Makalu before her. This is her peak as a climber. 30 years old, 4 expeditions to 8,000ers, 2 ascents without oxygen, one after the other, a national first. In the Veneto, they write about her regularly, the local press, club bulletins, evenings at climbing sections. A national celebrity she does not become, though. In Italy, those years belong to loud male names, and to the race for all 14 summits. And a nurse who takes one mountain a year on her own money does not fit into that story. She will be remembered differently, too. Not for a list of summits, but for a nickname and for the poems she wrote between shifts. They have 2 plans for the 2009 season, both of them in Pakistan, Broad Peak and Gasherbrum 1. The scheme is the familiar one: travel once, set up a base camp, try to take 2 mountains in a single trip. In the Italian tradition, Broad Peak is often called K3, next door to K2 in the same row, like a younger relative. That is exactly how the news that July puts it. She was coming down from K3. For Cristina, this is the 5th expedition to an 8,000er. She is 31. She would have turned 32 in December. The season goes hard. The weather in the Karakoram that summer is unstable. The windows between spells of bad weather are short, and the teams sit down below for long stretches, staring at the forecasts. In seasons like that, you set out not when the conditions are good, but when it becomes clear they are not going to get any better. Camp 4 is the last point before summit day. There are no tents above it, and everything that happens from there has to fit into a single push. On the 18th of July, 2009, the group leaves Camp 4. They are not the only ones on the route that day. The mountain runs on a shared timetable, and climbers from different teams are moving up onto the ridge at the same time. That is the usual picture for a short weather window. Everyone waited for the same day and set out together. The climb drags on. The Broad Peak Ridge is not a snow slope where you can gain height at a steady pace. It is a long line with rock outcrops, with sections where you have to go one at a time, and with an altitude where every step is paid for separately. The hours go faster than the meters. At this height, a lost schedule is not made up. The longer a person stays up there, the slower they move. By the middle of the day, it is clear that the schedule has fallen apart. And up there, at that altitude, a late hour is not an inconvenience. It decides everything. Around 3 in the afternoon, they come out onto Rocky Summit, the foresummit of Broad Peak, 8,028 meters. From here to the main point, there is that same ridge mentioned at the start of the episode, short on the map and long in time. 3 in the afternoon at 8,000 meters is already late. The descent will take more time than it looks from below, and the daylight is finite. And by that hour, the weather stops helping. Visibility drops, conditions get worse in front of their eyes. With things as they are, the main summit turns out to be unreachable. Going on would mean coming back in the dark along a ridge where mistakes are not allowed. The group turns down. Everyone who was up there that day turns around. The decision is a shared one. Turning back in a situation like that is not a defeat. It is arithmetic. It is at this point that the last photograph of Cristina Castagna alive is taken. The author is a member of that same climb. In the caption, he says it plainly. This is the highest point we reached on the summit ridge of Broad Peak. He also describes what came next. People were tired. The weather and the visibility were turning worse, and the group decided to begin a difficult descent. The photograph survived and remained the last piece of evidence of exactly where they were. This is worth saying right now, because further on, it will matter. The Italian press of 2009 will write that Cristina died after reaching the summit. The wording will spread through reprints and will live on to this day. The obituaries of that year were written fast, one copying another. But the account of the man who was right there beside her, and the summary of the season, say something else. They did not reach the main summit. Broad Peak never became her 5th 8,000er. It became her 5th expedition. And this is not a detail for pedants. Everything about the scene that will happen a few minutes later depends on it. The descent begins at once. And the descent here is harder than the climb. That is how this mountain is built, and it was said at the very beginning. You go up in your own tracks, and you come down through snow that has already been broken up, at the end of your strength, watching your own feet. One difference from most of the stories in this episode, here it is light. No darkness, no storm, no losing the way. Daytime, a little past 3 in the afternoon, people nearby. Everything is visible, everything is close, and there is someone to help. Cristina is coming down ahead of Giampaolo Casarotto, about 10 meters ahead. He sees everything. She slips. After that, it all takes seconds. She falls and goes into a crevasse, a break hidden under the snow, and there are plenty of them on this ridge. Casarotto climbs down to her. She is already dead. The words he said afterwards to a newspaper in Vicenza sound matter of fact, and that makes them heavier than any description. She was about 10 meters ahead of me when she slipped, hit the rocks, and fell into a crevasse. When I got down to her, all that was left for me was to cry. The altitude of this place varies widely from source to source. Italian publications speak of 7,000 meters. International summaries give a figure almost 800 meters higher. They never did come to an agreement. So the only honest way to put it is on the descent from Camp 4. No avalanche, no collapsing cornice, no failure of the body. A person who had been through Dhaulagiri and Makalu without oxygen slips on the descent, the way people slip on an icy street. The only difference is that what is underfoot here is not a sidewalk but the ridge of an 8,000er. Only a few minutes had passed between the shared decision to turn around and this moment. The same few minutes since the last photograph, the one where she is still on her feet. The body of Cristina Castagna remains on Broad Peak to this day. Usually in cases like this there is one explanation, and it is technical. In 2009, a helicopter evacuation from that altitude was simply impossible. The operating ceiling of the machines lay far lower, and there was no alternative other than carrying her down by hand. But in this story, there is a second reason, and it is the main one. Before leaving for Pakistan, Cristina left written instructions at home in case she died in the mountains. Short, a few lines addressed to her family. In them she asked, "If anything happens to me, leave me where the mountain called me to itself." The instructions were signed with her nickname, El Grillo. So the point was not that the body could not be brought down, and not that it could not be found. Its location was known. She had simply left her family an instruction in advance in case she died in the mountains, and the family carried it out. There is no other case like this in the whole episode. There were disappearances without a trace, falls onto the inaccessible side of a ridge, and searches that were called off because there was nowhere left to look. Cristina Castagna is the only one who was simply left where she was by her own will, written down in advance and signed with a nickname. A request written before departure takes the hardest choice away from the living, the very choice that gets rescuers themselves killed in the mountains. Cristina's family did not have to make it. She made it herself in advance. On the 1st of August, 2009, a mass is held for her in Valdagno. Colleagues from the hospital come, climbers from the local sections, neighbors from San Quirico. 2 years later, in 2011, a book about her comes out, The Dreamcatcher, by Massimo Fontana. Since then, in Italian writing about Cristina, that word stands next to her name more often than the list of her 8,000ers. The first memorial appears almost immediately, and very close to home. Her photograph is fixed to the summit cross of Monte Carrega, that same mountain seen from the window. Not a memorial plaque and not a monument, a photograph on a cross that local people walk past every weekend. It is the most grassroots form of remembrance in the Italian mountains. Not a name on a stone down below, but a photograph up top, where you have to climb on your own 2 feet. The second one appears 3 weeks later, and already in Pakistan. On the 10th of August, 2009, the climber and writer from Vicenza, Tarcisio Bello, makes a solo ascent of an unclimbed peak in the Hindu Kush, 5,311 meters. A first ascent gives the right to a name, and he calls it Cristina Castagna Peak. From that day on, her name stands on the map of Pakistan. The third memorial appears 15 years later, to the day. 15 years is usually how long it takes for someone to be forgotten. On the 10th of August, 2024, in the village of Gotolti, in the upper Ishkoman Valley in Gilgit-Baltistan, the Cristina Castagna Center opens. And it is not a memorial, it is a shelter and a training center. It prepares trekking guides and high-altitude porters, those very local mountain workers whose fate has already come up in this episode. A separate line of the center's work is the training of girls and women, which is a new thing for this valley. It was built by the Italian association Montagna e Solidarietà with the support of the Italian Alpine Club, and the driving force behind the project was that same Tarcisio Bello. A memorial expedition traveled to Pakistan in her memory as well, some 50 climbers from the Veneto. What comes out of it is a strange and exact symmetry. A woman who spent her whole life traveling to other people's mountains on her own leave, left behind in those mountains. A house where local people are taught to work on their own land. And on the mountain itself, nothing was left, at her own request. On the 31st of July, 2012, 13 people reached the main summit of Broad Peak. 12 of them were already on their way down when the last one arrived, 53-year-old Czech climber Zuzana Hofmannová, the first woman from her country to stand on that summit. She stayed up there for half an hour to take photographs. Then she stepped into the fog, which hung on until 2 in the afternoon. That same morning, her teammates had given up the summit to rescue a climber they didn't know. A day later, there was physically no one left with the strength to climb up and help her. The cause of her death is still unknown. Northern Bohemia, the town of Ústí nad Labem. On the 15th of June, 1959, a girl is born here who will later be known as Zuzana Hofmannová. Around the town lie the Elbe sandstones, low, rust-colored towers above the river. For Czech climbing, this is the main school. Sandstone is soft, it crumbles under metal, so hardware is almost never allowed on it. You climb on friction, on stemming, on bare fingers, and your protection is knots jammed into cracks. Someone who grows up on these rocks learns to count the risk in advance because a fall here rarely comes cheap. Zuzana starts right there, as a teenager. Her parents forbid her to climb. The band doesn't survive a single season. She goes off to the rocks and keeps going. Her first coach is Václav Šurl. By the early 80s, she's no longer just a local name. In February of 1982, she and Elena Chepelkova head to Piz-Badile in the Swiss Alps, to the line known as the English Route. Badile is a granite mountain on the border between Switzerland and Italy, and its northeast face is considered one of the classic walls of the Alps. Winter, 5 days of work, from the 12th to the 16th of February. It's the first winter ascent of the route by an all-female team. 3 years later, Peru. 1985, the north face of Huascarán, the highest mountain in the country. A women's team climbs the face for the first time in history, and back in Czechoslovakia, the ascent is named Climb of the Year. 13 years after that, in 98, Zuzana returns to the same wall and becomes the first Czech woman to have been there twice. Between expeditions, she has an ordinary job. She manages a store in the Hudi Sport chain. She doesn't own it. She runs it as an employee, stands behind the counter, orders stock. At home, her son Hansa is growing up. That combination was normal for Czech climbing in the 80s. A world-class athlete with a regular 9-to-5 schedule. The big mountains come into her life late. She starts collecting the major peaks of Asia only after 40. Lenin Peak, Khan Tengri, Korzenievskaya Peak, Izmail Somoni Peak, the 7,000ers of the former Soviet Union, the standard training ground before the 8,000ers. The 8,000ers begin in 2004, with Shishapangma, her first. 2 years later, in 2006, she climbs Manaslu and becomes the first Czech woman on that summit. In 2009, Cho Oyu, all 3 without oxygen. There were mountains she never closed out. Dhaulagiri and Annapurna state attempts, the expeditions happened, the summits didn't. In high-altitude climbing, the failures eat just as much time and money as the successes. In the summer of 2012, she goes to Pakistan. The expedition has a long, business-like name, the 2012 CZ Light Expedition, Dhiraan to Broad Peak. The word light in the title means lightweight style, a small team, minimal gear, no siege operation with dozens of porters. Pavel Matoshek is in charge. The team includes Olga Novakova, Antonin Bilik, nicknamed Tonda, and Veit Auermüller, nicknamed Laniak. The plan has 2 stages. First Diran, a mountain of about 7,260 meters, then a move over to Broad Peak. The first half of the plan falls apart. Nobody gets up Diran. Zuzana climbs above 6,800 and turns back with everyone else. The season in the Karakoram is short, and the weeks spent on Diran are gone for good. The team arrives at Broad Peak having already burned through part of the season and part of their strength. Zuzana is 53. If the mountain works out, it will be her 4th 8,000er. Up to that point, not a single Czech woman had stood on the main summit of Broad Peak. The summit push is set for the night of the 31st of July. People leave the high camp around 1 in the morning. By mountain standards, that's normal. You climb in the dark so you can get back down in daylight. Zuzana doesn't head up alone. Beside her are the Pole Paweł Michalski and 2 Iranian brothers, for part of the way they move roped together, protecting each other from dropping into a crevasse. The trail up from Camp 4 is broken by the Slovenian team Koroška 8000, led by Gregor Leschen. Breaking trail at 8,000 meters is the hardest work of the day. The first person plows through waist-deep untouched snow, and everyone behind moves along the ready track at half the effort. That day, 7 other people from various expeditions use the Slovenians' work. The weather that morning isn't great. The ridge is wrapped in fog, visibility is poor. It isn't a storm, you can move, but there's no horizon, and your only landmark is the track of the person ahead of you. At around 10 past 8 in the morning comes the first accident of the day. A Taiwanese climber named Kolun Chuang loses his footing just below the col at roughly 7,700 meters and ends up almost 200 meters lower among the crevasses. He's still alive. At that moment, Antonin Belik and Veit Auermüller are higher up. They have about 300 meters of climbing left to the summit, under 2 hours of movement, the home stretch of the entire season. They turn around and head down toward the Taiwanese climber. Getting a person out from that altitude is work that takes everything you have. The rescue lasts more than 3 hours. Chuang is brought down to Camp 4 and lower. He survives. Later, Belik is asked what it was like to give up a summit that was so close. His answer is short. I was very sorry about it, but the rescue was absolutely the priority. While Belik and Auermüller are bringing the Taiwanese climber down, the others above the col keep going toward the summit, each at their own pace. Waiting at that altitude means getting cold and burning strength for nothing, so the group quickly spreads out. In that line, Zuzana is the last. She's 53, she's climbing without oxygen, and the first half of the season has already been eaten by the failed attempt on Diran. That day, all 13 make it to the top. Zuzana arrives last, at exactly 11:30. In that same minute, she becomes the first Czech woman on the summit of this mountain, the 4th 8,000er of her life. From the entire Czech expedition, nobody else got up there. By 11:30, the other 12 are already turning back down. A summit isn't a town square. People don't gather there. Whoever arrived first leaves first. Zuzana arrives at the exact moment of the general ebb. She's in no hurry to leave. She stays on the summit another half hour. She takes pictures. Half an hour at 8,000 meters without oxygen is not a cheap thing, but this is her summit, and she's photographing it to keep. When she turns to go down, the slope below her is empty. Everyone who was on the mountain with her that morning is already lower, an hour and a half of movement ahead of her. On the way up, she had company. The Pole, the Iranians, someone else's Slovenian trail. She ends up alone, not on the ascent, but on the descent, behind everyone. The fog meets her immediately. The ridge only clears around 2 in the afternoon, which means the first hours of her way down happen in white milk, where you can't see the neighboring peaks, or the line of the ridge itself, or where the snow ends and empty air begins. This is the same narrow ridge between the 2 summits we talked about at the start of this episode. Nobody saw her again. Down below, in base camp, the evening of the 31st of July is spent waiting. People look up at the route and wait for a dot to appear on the snowfield. They wait until dusk. No dot appears. By the morning of the 1st of August, there's nothing left to wait for. On an 8,000er, a person who hasn't come back by nightfall almost always means one thing. Antonin Belik goes back up. The same Belik who 24 hours earlier had given up the summit and spent 3 hours bringing the Taiwanese climber down. He gets almost as far as the col. Nothing. No tracks, no gear, no point where the trail breaks off. And that's where it all ends. There was no organized search and rescue operation for Zuzana Hofmannová. It wasn't turned back by the weather, it wasn't called off at the family's request. It wasn't declared hopeless after several days of work. It simply never started, not because nobody wanted to, but because there was physically no one left who could go up a second time. The reason isn't indifference, the reason is physical. A summit day at 8,000 meters takes a person's entire reserve. And the day before, this team had also spent 3 hours rescuing a climber they didn't know, and that costs no less strength than the summit itself. The body doesn't recover in one night. The people capable of a second climb were lying in their tents, unable to get up. This is where the line runs between how it looks in the movies and how it actually works. In the mountains, there's no separate rescue service that shows up when you call. The rescuers are the same people who just came down from the summit. They simply had nothing left for a second climb. On the 3rd of August, the expedition packed up and went home. There is no body. There's also no place where it all ended. Nobody knows at which meter of the ridge she was gone. Our Miller would put it exactly the way climbers put such things. That's the danger of expeditions like this. Sometimes they can end this way too. The first word to travel from base camp back to the Czech Republic is avalanche. That's how the earliest report of what happened sounds. It couldn't be confirmed. Nobody saw an avalanche, and no trace of one was found. Czech sources that went through this story later offer a different main version, a simpler one, that Zuzana is believed to have either slipped or broken through a snow cornice and fallen down the Chinese side of the mountain. We've already covered in this episode what a cornice is, a snow overhang above a drop, indistinguishable from solid ridge when you're standing on top of it. There's one detail here that belongs to her alone. She was moving through fog. In that white haze, you lose not only the view, but your very sense of direction. The ridge stops reading, and a person drifts a few steps further, right or further left than they should. On an ordinary slope, that doesn't matter. On a corniced ridge, that difference decides everything. But that's a version, not an established fact. The cause of Zuzana Hofmannová's death is still unknown. Elena Chepelkova, her partner from Pizbadile, said that everything in this story rests on guesswork. There was no information from the expedition, only one short text message to the family. According to her, Zuzana was far too experienced to take pointless risks, and she herself still turns the possible scenarios over in her mind. Zuzana's husband, known by the nickname Konik, traveled to Pakistan to look for her. How that trip ended isn't described anywhere. On the 19th of March, 2013, Plulík and Auermuller received the main Fair Play Award from the Czech Fair Play Club under the Olympic Committee for the year 2012. For the Taiwanese climber and for the summit they gave up. That same year, Zuzana Hofmannová was made an honorary member of the Czech Mountaineering Union posthumously. Memorial plaques stand in Ostrov-u-Tisé and on the Climbers' Monument in Tisa. 10 years go by. In 2022, 2 Czech women head to Broad Peak, Karolina Grohová and Kateřina Mandulova. They climb as a women's rope team, alpine style, no oxygen, no high-altitude porters, no ropes fixed by somebody else's hands. It's the most honest and the most exposed way to climb an 8,000er. For Grohová, it's only the second high-altitude expedition of her life. A year earlier, she had climbed Gasherbrum too. Before leaving, Grohová talks with Petr Prachtel. Who exactly he is, the sources don't explain. Just a man who knows the mountain and knows what to warn people about. He says one thing to her: be careful, that summit ridge swallows women climbers. Neither of them reached the main summit. Grohová turned around at the rocky summit 4 Peak, the very point already mentioned in this episode. Beyond it, the ridge began, and she didn't go out onto it. Mandulova also stayed below the main summit. On exactly where she turned back, the sources disagree. Both of them came home. About Zuzana Hofmannová, everything is known up to 11:30, and nothing at all after it. There's the time she stood on the summit. There are the 30 minutes she spent up there with a camera. After that, fog, and a blank line in the timeline that nobody will ever fill in. Matoshek and Novakova wrote on the expedition's website that since 2003 they had been on 9 expeditions together, and that they still can't believe they won't see her again, not in the mountains and not on the rocks. Of the 13 people who reached the summit of Broad Peak on the 31st of July, 2012, 12 came back down. The one who didn't was the one who reached the top last. On the 7th of July, 2006, the Austrian Markus Kronthaler stood on the main summit of Broad Peak. He was 40 minutes walk away from the safe part of the ridge, those same 40 minutes we talked about at the start. He didn't cover them in an hour, and he didn't cover them in a day. 6 months earlier, he had survived a free fall of 150 meters. Here, nothing knocked him off his feet at all. His body stayed at 8,030 meters and remained there for exactly a year, in plain view of everyone climbing that mountain. And then, his brother went up for him. Kufstein sits on the River Inn, right on the border between Tyrol and Bavaria. The mountains here begin immediately behind the last houses of the town, and a child growing up in a valley like that usually gets to know rock before he gets to know a school blackboard. Markus Kronthaler was born in Kufstein on the 5th of April, 1967. By the age of 39, he had managed to live 2 lives that barely overlapped, and the second of them started with a letter of resignation. The first life was in uniform. Kronthaler was a gendarme in an Alpine unit, that part of the Austrian police which works where no vehicle can get through. Men like that pull tourists off cliff faces, look for people lost in fog, dig skiers out from under avalanche debris. The job gives you a steady wage, a pension, and a very clear idea of how a mistake in the mountains ends. In 2003, he left the service. He didn't transfer, he didn't take leave. He quit to become a professional mountaineer. In Austria, that's an understandable decision, but not a safe one. High-altitude mountaineering doesn't pay a salary. It gives you sponsors, lectures, photographs, and a reputation. And every bit of that has to be confirmed each year with a new summit. He had plenty to confirm it with. In 2000, he climbed Shishapangma. In 2002, Ama Dablam, the sharp Nepali peak that climbers call the most beautiful mountain in the Himalayas. In 2004, he had 2 big seasons at once. Mustag Atta in China and Nanga Parbat, an 8,000er with a reputation as one of the most dangerous mountains on the planet. None of those mountains killed him. A man who knew mountains from their ugliest side through his job, and who had climbed 4 major Asian peaks, was not going to be stopped by a fall or an avalanche. He would be stopped by his own body, at around 8,000 meters, between 2 summits of one and the same mountain. And it would happen several years after he handed in his service badge. Before that came the winter. In January 2006, Kronthaler came off and fell freely for about 150 meters before snow stopped him. A few seconds, the kind of time in which people usually manage neither to get frightened nor to do anything at all. He survived. 150 meters is the height of a 40-story building. In the mountains, falls like that end the same way. And the only thing that decides the outcome is what a person lands in. Kronthaler got snow of the right depth and the right softness. The German sources kept no details of that accident. No slope, no route, no mention of who was next to him. All that's left is the number and what came of it. By May, he was on an expedition again. Not in rehab, not on cautious weekend outings. At the head of a large Asian expedition. About 4 months passed between the fall and the flight to Pakistan. There isn't a single mention anywhere of him missing even one planned trip. The plan was a double one, Chogalisa and Broad Peak, 2 Karakoram mountains standing almost side by side. A pairing like that is the ordinary logic of a professional who counts his seasons. 1 flight, 1 caravan, 1 set of permits, 2 possible results. For a man who earns his living from summits, that's sensible economy. For a body that 4 months earlier had survived a fall from the height of a 40-story building, it's quite a lot. He led the expedition himself. That's a separate load, one people rarely count. The leader answers for the logistics, for the porters, for the money, for the call on whether to go up or wait. He sleeps worse than anyone and goes to bed last. And he's the one who finds it hardest to say out loud that the season has come to nothing. What he himself thought about the January fall is unknown. No interview on the subject has survived. All we know is what he did. He went back to the mountains at the first opportunity and immediately set the bar higher than before. In the biography of a professional mountaineer, a turn like that looks like the norm of the trade. 6 months later, it would become its price. The Karakoram summer of 2006 went wrong from the very beginning. The weather wrecked one attempt after another. The team would climb up to the higher camps, sit and wait it out, come back down, and start again. That's the most draining form an expedition can take. Not a fight, but a wait, in which acclimatization slowly turns into wear and tear. By the start of July, it was clear that there was almost no time left. Permits, money, booked return tickets, porters who had to be released, all of that has a deadline. The 7th of July, 2006, was the last chance of the season, and Kronthaler took it. He set out for the top with one partner, Sepp Bachmeier, a climber from Salzburg. Not much is known about Bachmeier. Austrian sources name him as Kronthaler's companion that day, and confirmed that he survived and came down to base camp. Everything else we know about Kronthaler's last day and night ultimately goes back to him. A summit day on Broad Peak is built like this. Leave in the dark, a long climb up to the col, then the ridge. First the foresummit, a rocky bump at 8,028 meters, where the climbing ends and where the thing we discussed at the beginning of this episode begins. An almost horizontal stretch of ridge to the main summit, about 40 minutes of walking. A lot of people turn round here. Kronthaler didn't turn round. On Friday, the 7th of July, the summit of Broad Peak was finally under Kronthaler's feet. The 12th-highest 8,000er in the world, taken on the last possible day of the season, after a spring eaten up by bad weather, and after a January in which he fell 150 meters. As a sporting result, it was a complete victory. The descent from the summit back to the foresummit takes those same 40 minutes, and on paper, it's no harder than the way up. And here begins the part of the story that has been retold wrongly for years. In the popular versions, Kronthaler reaches the summit and dies a few minutes later. A neat, frightening, and very convenient picture. In reality, more than a full day passed between the summit and his death. Austrian television, ORF, recorded a line at the time that puts everything in its place. On the descent from the foresummit, they could go no further, and Markus died of exhaustion in the night leading into Saturday. So the summit was on Friday, and the death came in the night of the 8th of July. Between those 2 points lie 2 unplanned bivouacs at around 8,000 meters. An unplanned bivouac means no tent, no sleeping bag, no stove, no water. People sit down where their strength has run out and stay there until dawn, because moving along the ridge in darkness is more dangerous than sitting still. The Austrian reports name the cause of death directly: exhaustion and dehydration. Not the pulmonary edema we went through in detail in Pete Thexton's story. Not injury, not a fall. The body simply ran out of fuel and ran out of water. And at 8,000 meters, neither of those replenishes itself. Without a stove, there's nowhere to get water. Snow is everywhere, but eating it is pointless. It takes more warmth than it gives moisture. The body grows weaker without water and food, and a man who was physically healthy a day earlier discovers that he can't stand up. This isn't a seizure, and it isn't a stroke. It's slow subtraction. The hardest thing in this story is the distance. From the place where they stop to the main summit is 40 minutes, and the same again going down to the foresummit, where the normal descent begins. A man who the day before had covered that stretch twice could no longer cover it a third time. Not because a drop or a cliff was in the way, but because his body refused. Kronthaler died that night. Bachmeier was left alone on the ridge and came down to base camp by himself. There's no sense in arguing about what he could have done differently. At that altitude, one man can neither carry another nor stay beside him longer than his own reserves allow. His body stayed up there, at roughly 8,030 meters. No attempt was made to bring him down at the time. The operation was judged too dangerous. At that altitude, a recovery puts the rescuers themselves at risk. Polish climbers who happened to be nearby did the only thing that was possible. They buried him in the snow, right there on the spot. Everyone who bought a permit for that mountain the following season knew that he had been left on the route. A snow grave on a ridge usually works. Snow drifts in, the layer grows, and after a season, the place can no longer be found. Here, it didn't work. The ridge of Broad Peak is swept by wind constantly, and the wind strips fresh snow away faster than it can settle. His body remained visible. For a whole year, everyone heading for the main summit of Broad Peak passed by. Not off to one side, not somewhere down below the route, right along the very stretch between the foresummit and the summit, along the only road up. The place where he remained lay exactly halfway along a path that everybody covers twice, going up and coming back. The mountain neither hid him nor gave him back. This is where all the threads of this episode come together. At the start of the episode, we went into why this mountain has such strange statistics. It has 2 summits. Between them lie those 40 minutes. And it is precisely that stretch which takes away people's time, their strength, and their margin of safety. Cristina Castagna died after turning back from the 4 summit. Kronthaler died having gone all the way across it. He died literally inside the explanation, in that gap we were talking about. This story has a second peculiarity within the episode. In 5 of the 10 stories, there is no body at all. 1 man was carried over to the Chinese side, 1 was never found, 1 was searched for, and never recovered. Here it's the other way round. There is a body, the place is known to within a meter, and the way to it is the ordinary climbing route. And that is exactly what turned out to be unbearable for the family. Not the not knowing, but knowing too precisely. Back in Kufstein, there was a brother. The Austrian press at the time described Georg Kronthaler briefly. He went to the mountains too. He knew what altitude was, and he knew exactly where Markus was. Austrian sources don't say what he did in ordinary life. That detail was invented later by popular retellings. He lived with that knowledge for a year, and then he did what relatives of people lost on 8,000ers rarely do. He went up for him himself. The headline in the Kufstein newspaper preserved his own words. I had to go up there to bring my dead brother home. Not wanted to, not decided to, had to. There is no sport in that sentence, no record, no mountaineering as such. It's a family matter, settled by mountaineering means. He spent almost a year putting the expedition together, and the lineup shows how soberly he had worked it all out. Stefan Lackner went with him. They took on 5 high-altitude porters. Not for prestige, but because a human body at that altitude cannot be carried by 2 men. And along with them, a film crew from the German channel Pro7 arrived at the glacier. It's better to talk about the cameras straight away, because people asked about it back then and have asked ever since. Part of the climbing community took the filming badly. They felt that a brother's funeral shouldn't become television material, and that the presence of a camera changes people's motivation at 8,000 meters. Another part objected on practical grounds. An expedition like that costs a great deal. No rescue budget covers it. And without the channel, the money for it most likely simply wouldn't have been found. Both positions were voiced in 2007 and are still voiced today. What is known as a fact is this. Without that expedition, the body would have stayed on the ridge forever. Georg never publicly defended himself on the subject. The whole operation, together with the walk-in and the acclimatization, took about a month. A month of work to reach one point on a ridge and begin the descent that the whole thing had been set up for. On the 20th of July, 2007, they began the descent. The 20th of July is the date from the German publications. In some sources, it's shifted by a day. By that moment, the hardest part for a climber, the climb into the death zone, finding the place, digging out the snow grave, was behind them. And what began was work for which mountaineering has no separate word. The body weighed about 90 kilograms, together with clothing, boots, equipment, and the ice that had frozen onto it over the year. 90 kilograms on flat ground takes 4 men to carry, and they still get tired. On the ridge and on the rocky sections, a load like that demanded constant rope work and extreme care, in a place where neither the load nor the people could afford to go down. The work took 4 days. 4 days in the upper part of an 8,000er is in itself on the edge of what's permissible. Up there, you can't recover, you can't sleep properly, you can't eat properly. Each of those days reduced the whole team's margin of safety, and any accident on the way down would have turned one tragedy into 2. From the ridge to base camp is 3,000 meters of altitude difference. That's a height an ordinary mountain expedition climbs over weeks, breaking it up into 4 camps. They went down through it with a load that could neither help nor hold itself. All the weight and all the risk were on the team. At base camp, the body was received and prepared for transport. From that point on, it was no longer a mountaineering machine at work, but a State One. A helicopter of the Pakistani Armed Forces came for him, the only transport capable of taking a load off a Karakoram glacier. This operation is still called the highest body recovery in the history of mountaineering. Formally, nobody keeps or certifies a record like that. There's no single register, cases are hard to compare, and it's more accurate to put it exactly that way. It is called that. But even without the title, the figures speak for themselves. 8,030 meters, 90 kilograms, 4 days, 7 people, and 1 helicopter. Markus Kronthaler came home in the summer of 2007, a year after he had left. He was cremated in Innsbruck, and the urn was buried in the municipal cemetery of Kufstein, in the very town where he was born. Formally, the story ended there. A man died in the mountains and now lies at home. What remained was the footage. The film crew brought material back from the Karakoram, and out of it a film was made, A Grave in the Icy Heights, Evacuation from the Death Zone. The 72-minute version was shown in a cinema in Kufstein on the 14th of December, 2007. At home first, in other words, for the people who knew Markus personally. The television broadcast on ProSieben followed on the 6th of January 2008. The order of those screenings is perhaps the best answer to the reproaches about the cameras. Kufstein first, then all of Germany. The interview Georg gave later to an Austrian newspaper is titled, "We brought home more than just my brother." He didn't unpack that phrase, and we're not going to do it for him. Among the 10 stories in this episode, Kronthaler stands apart for one reason. There's no avalanche here, no cornice, no fall, no disappearance, no one else's mistake, no argument about what happened, no missing witness. There's a healthy, experienced man who had just won and who simply ran out of strength. And that turned out to be just as deadly as a 2-kilometer drop beneath his feet. An 8,000er doesn't have to throw a man down. It's enough for it to hold him at altitude a little longer than he'd planned, and to take away his water. The body does the rest by itself. And one last thing. Of everyone who stayed on that mountain, only Markus Kronthaler came home. Not because his case was simpler or the mountain kinder, but because he had a brother who climbed to 8,000 meters and spent 4 days bringing 90 kilograms down. In the other 9 stories of this episode, no such person was found. On the 26th of June, 2008, 2 Slovaks split up at 7,200 meters to head for the same summit by different routes. Only one of them came back down. The body of 45-year-old Vlado Plulík, a man who had climbed Everest without oxygen, has never been found. But this story doesn't end with the search. 5 months later, the Mountaineering Commission of the Slovak Mountaineering Union would meet in Maninska Tiesňava and officially establish that what had been said about that expedition was not true. And here's the key part. Having established what was untrue, the commission was never able to establish what was true. Vladimir Plulík was born on the 3rd of March, 1963, in the Slovak town of Piešťany, a small spa town in the west of the country, well known for its thermal springs and not known at all for mountains. He came to the mountains the way most Slovaks of his generation did, through a club, through weekends on Tatra routes, through cheap homemade gear and people who climb for something other than money. He never left that world. Plulík had no sponsor logos on his jacket, no column in a magazine, no manager. He called what he did a small sport, and he meant that not as self-deprecation, but as a position. He couldn't stand the world of showy fame. A narrow circle of Slovak climbers knew about his ascents, and that suited him fine. He ran in the mountains a lot, and he ran seriously. Later, after he disappeared, that would come back in an unexpected way. Since 2009, Slovakia has held a mountain race in his memory from Srdiečko to Chopok. The style he chose in the mountains matched his character. Minimum gear, minimum outside help, maximum self-sufficiency. Go on your own, carry your own, depend on nobody else's schedule. By the summer of 2008, he was 45, and he was one of the most experienced high-altitude climbers in the country, even though most of his countrymen couldn't have told you his name. That modesty came at a price. A man who kept no public records and gave no interviews left an almost empty space exactly where the truth would later have to be reconstructed. He would have no voice of his own in this story. On the 16th of January, 1997, he stepped onto the main ridge of the High Tatras, alone in winter, intending to traverse the whole thing without stopping. 26 kilometers from Laliové Sedlo to Kopské Sedlo, not along the trails below, but along the crest itself, with all its towers, gaps, and rock sections. In summer, that traverse is broken into several days, with nights in mountain huts. Plulík went in winter and did not stop at a single hut. He laid no food or gear caches along the way. Everything he would need, he carried from the first step. The difference between going a long time and going without stopping matters here. Stopping in winter on a ridge means losing heat. And in the cold, your body only makes heat by moving. A non-stop traverse is less a question of strength than of managing your own condition for 2 days straight. He reached Kolpske Sedlo on the 19th of January, 50 hours on the ridge in all. He wrote about that climb himself in the club magazine Jemisak in the second issue of that same year. The text is short, with no grand words and no attempt to explain why it was worth doing. And it turned out to be almost the only detailed document in which Plulík talks about himself in his own words. You can already see here the signature that would stay with him: alone, light, without witnesses. In the Tatras, that's pure sporting style. In the Karakoram, 11 years later, the same thing would mean that there was nobody nearby who could say what had happened. He tried the Himalayas for the first time in 97. Gangchenjunga, the third highest mountain in the world. The expedition ended with nothing, no summit. A year later, he went to Everest and climbed it without supplementary oxygen. The fourth Slovak on the highest point of the planet, and the first of them to do it, breathing the air that's actually there at 8,500 meters. The difference between climbing with oxygen and without is roughly the difference between running and running with your mouth clamped shut. There's 3 times less air, and everything in your body and your head slows down. Back home, the climb was named Ascent of the Year. After that comes the stretch that obituaries usually leave out. 2002, Shishapangma, no summit. 2005, Cho Oyu, no summit. Both of those mountains are considered relatively accessible on the 8,000er list, and he came away from both without the top. It adds up to strange arithmetic for a high-altitude climber. Over 11 years, 1 undisputed big summit, and 3 expeditions that ended in going back down. For a man climbing without oxygen and without commercial backing, that's a normal record. He turned around when the mountain wouldn't let him through, and he did it 3 times. That detail would matter later. Plulík was not the type of climber who pushes upward at any cost. He knew how to retreat, and retreating was a habit of his. By the spring of 2008, one area was still unfinished for him. Not the Himalayas, where he had already tried everything, but the Karakoram, the neighboring range, where the mountains are lower in absolute height, but meaner in weather and terrain. That's where he was heading, and he was going in seriously. Not for one mountain, but for several at once. The project he joined in the spring of 2008 was called Baltoro Express. The name says it all: the Baltoro Glacier, the approach route to every big mountain in the area, and the word express, meaning fast, one after another, with no trip home in between. The plan called for 4 8,000ers in a single season: Gasherbrum 2, Gasherbrum 1, Broad Peak, and K2. Each of those mountains is normally its own expedition, with its own acclimatization and its own month of your life. Taking 4 in a row means not coming down from altitude between May and August, and living in a state where the body doesn't recover. It only spends itself. Plulík's partner on the project was the Slovak climber Josef Kopold. On the 15th of June, the pair claimed an ascent of Gasherbrum 1, also known as Hidden Peak, hidden, because from the glacier you can't see it behind the surrounding walls. A note is needed here, without which nothing further will make sense. The Slovak Mountaineering Commission later found that Kopold's claim to that summit could not be verified, but that would only come out half a year afterwards. In June 2008, nobody was disputing anything. The pair claimed the ascent and moved on to Broad Peak. Broad Peak was the third point of the 4. They came to it already acclimatized, with 2 months of work at altitude behind them, and a sense that the schedule was holding. From the outside, it looked like an expedition going well. 2 strong climbers, a serious plan, half of it already done. Nobody had any questions for them, not at base camp, not back home in Slovakia. The questions came later, and they came all at once. On the 25th of June, 2008, the 2 men climbed to a cache at around 7,200 meters. A tent, food, and part of their gear were stashed there, standard practice when a mountain is being prepared in advance. They went no further that day. The weather wouldn't let them, and they spent the night at the cache. A night at 7,200 is not rest. At that altitude, the body sleeps badly, food is digested badly, and every extra hour costs strength you'll need higher up. In the morning, they set out. At around 8 in the morning, on the 26th of June, the two partners went their separate ways. That decision is the central point of the whole story. Each man took his own route to the summit, having agreed to meet higher up. In sporting mountaineering that happens, climbers with different techniques sometimes work in parallel rather than roped together. But that decision has a price. Once they split, the two stopped being each other's safety. Nobody holds a man who falls. Nobody helps when the body gives out. Nobody notices that the other one has stopped moving. And there's a second price that nobody was thinking about at that moment. By splitting up, they left the story without a witness. From 8 in the morning on the 26th of June, there was not a single person next to Vlado Plulík who could later say what happened to him. Everything after that is reconstructed from two sources. The first is the account of Józef Kopold, the only one of the two who came back. The second is the observations of outsiders who were working on the same mountain in those same days. Those two sources describe different events, and the discrepancy between them was such that sorting it out fell not to climbers, but to a commission. Working on Broad Peak at the same time were the Russians Valery Bobanov and Viktor Lutov. They had nothing to do with the Slovak expedition and weren't following it in particular. They were simply on the slope, looking up from time to time, the way everyone does when they're working alongside other teams. Their observations turned out to be the most precise record of that day. By 5 in the evening on the 26th of June, the pair were at around 7,800 meters. That's already high. About 250 vertical meters remain to the summit of Broad Peak. But, in time, it's far more than that number suggests, because the hardest part is still ahead. About an hour later, the picture changed. At around 6 in the evening, Plulík was seen lower down. He was descending, not up, but down, and he came to roughly 7,600 meters, and there he stayed. Until dark. Here's what that observation means, laid out calmly. A man climbed almost to the mark where the final part of the route begins, then dropped 200 meters of his own accord and stopped. That is how a climber behaves who has turned around from 8,000ers 3 times in his career. Then it got dark. And at that point, the observations break off. Nobody ever saw Vlado Plulík again. Not on the way up, not on the way down, not the next day. The meaning of those 2 times, 5 in the evening and 6 in the evening, would only become clear 5 months later. It was the observations of Bobanov and Lutov that the commission later accepted as reliable. It made for a situation that's rare in the mountains. The testimony of outsiders watching from a distance formed the basis of the official conclusions about the events of that day. Morning came. The Russians looked at the slope again, and again they noted the time. At 9 in the morning, on the 27th of June, they saw one man descending the route at around 6,400 meters. It would later become clear that this was Józef Kopold. There was no second man on the slope, not above, not below, not off to the side. Here begins the part where all that's left is an account. According to Kopold, he last saw Plulík at around 8 in the evening on the 26th of June, at roughly 7,900 meters. In his words, Plulík was at that moment digging a snow cave below the rocky summit 4 peak, that is, preparing for a cold night in the snow, without a tent. This account did not stay the same. Kopold first said that Plulík had gone back to the normal route, that is, to the usual line of ascent. Later, he said something different, that Plulík was moving about 100 meters to his left, in the same face. There's one more detail that is spread widely through retellings of this story. There is a claim that on the 27th of June, a Belarusian group saw Plulík at around 6,500 meters. It was never confirmed. The Belarusian group was never located, and the figure itself comes from Kopold's account, rather than from an independent source. What remains is what was recorded. On the 26th of June, before dark, Plulík was at 7,600 and was descending. On the morning of the 27th of June, one man was moving down the slope. Between those two observations lies a night for which there is not a single piece of testimony. That is the gap the whole story fell into, not at any specific recorded moment, but into the darkness between 2 days, where no observer was left. The people who went looking were strangers. Valery Bobanov, the same man who had been noting times and altitudes the day before, climbed in bad weather towards the second camp, trying to find anything at all: tracks, belongings, an abandoned rucksack. Another 4 or 5 climbers from other teams worked around the first camp. Nothing came of it. No man, no gear, no tracks in the snow. And so, Vlado Plulík stayed on Broad Peak, in a place where nobody has ever found him. But this story has a second half, and it begins not in the mountains, but in Slovakia, with an ordinary question: who reported it and when? Back home, nobody knew Plulík was missing for 3 days. For 3 days, the country, the Federation, and the family had no information at all that one of Slovakia's strongest high-altitude climbers had not come back from the mountain. On the 7th of July, 2008, the president of the Slovak Mountaineering Union, Igor Koller, published the organization's official position. He did it before Kopold returned to Slovakia, that is, without waiting for explanations and without letting the story quietly settle. Koller's main objection was stated plainly: 3 days of silence are absolutely unacceptable. It isn't hard to see why that matters, whether a search gets organized at all, and whether anyone can reach the place while there's still even a theoretical chance, depends on the information that a man hasn't come down. Every hour has a price here, and 3 days is already a different story, one in which all you can look for is a body. From that July statement, the case changed its nature. It stopped being a mountain accident, the kind climbers sort out among themselves, and became an official inquiry with documents, a hearing, and a signed ruling. 5 months passed. On the 29th of November, 2008, the Mountaineering Commission of the Slovak Mountaineering Union met in Maninska Tiesňava, a narrow rock gorge in western Slovakia, one of the traditional gathering places for local climbers. Ivan Gila chaired the meeting. The commission stressed that the case was unprecedented, and that the assessment had been carried out with the greatest possible pragmatism, impartiality, and objectivity. The wording of the ruling is worth giving exactly as it was written down. The commission stated that the information about the events of the Baltoro Express expedition provided by Josef Kopold did not correspond to the facts. As a separate point, Vlado Plulík never climbed from the third camp by the normal route on Broad Peak, and did not bivouac below the rocky summit. Then comes the sentence that weighs more than any other in that document. The Commission does not know the reasons for the false information, and from an ethical and human point of view, those reasons are unacceptable and deserving of condemnation. The claimed descents of Gasherbrum 1 and Broad Peak were not confirmed. The Commission described the accounts of the circumstances of Plulík's death as a grave violation of the ethical and sporting principles of the Mountaineering Union. The sanction was worded as incompatibility with a place on the national team. The detail on which the discrepancy turned is purely geographical. The face the two men climbed into is the face of the forepeak, the rocky summit, not the face of the main summit. In the messages that went down the mountain during the expedition, it was repeatedly called the face of the main summit. To anyone who knows the mountain, the difference between them is obvious, and it was that difference that made it possible to match the account against the terrain. What happened afterwards in Josef Kopold's professional life is a separate subject, and it isn't dealt with here. We'll stay with what went into the official ruling. There is something important that isn't in the ruling and couldn't be. The Commission established which information did not correspond to the facts, what actually happened, that it never managed to find out. All the work an inquiry would normally do was taken on by his sister. Jana Plulíková created a website in her brother's memory, translated the Commission's documents into English, interviewed climbers who had been in those places in those days herself, and published the family's final position. The site vladoplulík.sk is still running today. 2 places to go also appeared. At the so-called cemetery at Urdukas, on the Baltoro Glacier, where plaques stand for those who died in this area, a plaque was put up for Plulík. It was made and installed by Peter Hamor and Piotr Morawski. From there, you look out at Broad Peak. A second plaque was placed back home, below Ostrava in the Tatras. And on the 6th of August, 2009, a document appeared on the site that has no equivalent in any other story in this episode. More than a year after he disappeared, the family published a list of what Vlado Plulík was wearing and what he was carrying on the 25th and 26th of June, 2008. Yellow and black high-altitude boots, La Sportiva, black trousers, a red and black mammoth jacket, a blue hat, exbionic thermal underwear, a red, black, and gray rucksack, black gloves, Julbo glasses in a black frame, poles and crampons. In the rucksack, a Petzl ice tool, 15 meters of 6mm rope, an ice screw, 2 or 3 carabiners, a flask, energy bars, and a silver Olympus camera. It's a list of things, every one of which is still lying somewhere on that mountain to this day. The list ends with a single line: "The family will be grateful for any information from climbers who were on Broad Peak." Out of the 10 stories in this episode, in 5 there isn't even a body. Some were left without a witness, others had far too many witnesses, and for others there was nobody who could go up and search. Here, it wasn't only a man who disappeared. The truth about what happened to him disappeared too. And this is the one story of the mountain that still cannot be closed.